I'm Alan Gravel. I'm the board chairman of the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association Foundation, and we welcome you here today. Appreciate you coming. As is our custom with with AVVBA events, we want to start today with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you'd all stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Be seated. You didn't come to hear me talk, so we'll keep this short. But I do have a few things I need to say. One is that early on in putting this together, we were able to believe in the possibility of it because Atlanta History Center stepped up and made this venue available for us, and we thank them very much. The second organization that stepped up and gave us a green light head forward was Synovus, when they generously contributed to allow us to hold this symposium without utilizing any of our funds that are earmarked for memorials or for scholarships for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. So we appreciate their participation. Corporate values of Chick-fil-A are so well known that I doubt any of you are surprised that they're furnishing lunch today. Not reluctantly or begrudgingly, but generously, and with revealing a deep commitment to the values that made this country great. We wouldn't be here today without the help of our speakers and our moderator, S.J.D. with the Vietnam Veterans for Factual History, and the speakers Bob Turner, Michael Kort, and Mark Moyar. No amount of money or coercion or persuasion could get these men to travel as they have to come here unless they were deeply committed to the accuracy of history and to helping to correct some of the myths about the Vietnam War. We thank them very much. And lastly, many members of AVVBA have helped to put this thing together, and other organizations, and I can't name all of you, but I have to name a few people. And first of all is Jim Dixon, and then Rod Knowles, John Butler, Bob Hopkins. Those have participated. They've worked hard for 4 or 5 months putting this together. So without further ado, I want to introduce our moderator, S.J.D. with the Vietnam Veterans for Factual History, and he will run the show for us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Actually, I want to depart for a moment. I'm at the age where finding myself standing amongst a bunch of people who stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance is still heartwarming. And it reminded me of something. I do a lot of high school lectures. And last fall, I was at a high school, and we were saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and one student did not stand up in the front row and just sat there. And I looked at her and didn't say anything. Later, she came up to me because she wanted to assure me she didn't mean to disrespect me. And I said, thank you very much, but why would you not stand and say it? She said, well, because I'm not a hypocrite. And I said, how is it hypocritical? She said, well, we don't have perfect liberty and justice for all. And I thought for a second. I said, well, of course, you're exactly right. We didn't have perfect liberty and justice for all in 1776. We didn't have it yesterday. We don't have it today. And we won't have it tomorrow. By the way, what nation anywhere at any time ever has? We are human beings. We are fallible. If your criteria for what's okay is perfection, you're going to be disappointed. What's important is what is good. And this country is good. When we say the Pledge of Allegiance, it's not an arrogant claim of our perfection. It's a statement of our ideals, of what we work towards, what we've always worked towards and made progress for the last 200 some odd years and we're still making progress towards it. And I said, there's so much more in our history that we should look at, and acknowledging our flaws and faults and mistakes and imperfections. There's so much more to look at that we can take pride in rather than shame. And this country is worthy of our respect, our affection, and for some of us even, our love. And therefore, I'd like you to reconsider the next time you want to hear about the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, ladies, gentlemen, fellow veterans, welcome guests, all gentle beings, good morning. Kin chao kui vi. We are here as guests of the AVBA Foundation as part of their continued service to the nation. A lot of us veterans remember that we took an oath to support the country, our nation, and we're still involved in doing that, and probably will be until they put us in a box and stow us away someplace. They want to provide well-founded inputs on the history of the Vietnam War. Every major human event ends up with being described in later times across a range of ways. And after all, huge events like wars have layers of complexities. So different people will examine different aspects, often from different viewpoints. Perceptions and biases will affect what is thought and written. Sometimes there's room to see the same event in different ways, even when good people consider the same set of facts. But there's always the possibility of misperceptions, biases, incomplete information, and inaccuracies entering into the accounts that are drawn up. And arguments arise about what is the truest version of history. The most significant event of the 20th century was World War II, a war with perhaps the simplest and clearest moral imperative ever known. Yet there's been a bitter dispute among historians, among a few, over the use of atomic bombs during the Pacific War, in which some tried to prove it was unnecessary and the worst war crime ever, and that Harry Truman was a terrible war criminal. This was eventually effectively rebutted by the facts as shown not in Allied records, but in the records of the Japanese Imperial Council. But it was interesting that that debate went on for a while. In fact, there's still some people who still hang on to it, even though the data from the Japanese are perfectly clear. The conflict in Vietnam certainly had its complexities and has been reported and written about by a large host of people with a very wide range of viewpoints, often from those who had strong emotional positions on what to perceive, sometimes from those who had been very active in their opposition to or support of the war. The strong emotions of the time, which was also a time when other major cultural changes were taking place in the nation, were inflamed by dramatic images of all sorts. Men executed in the streets, monks burning themselves up, little girls running naked and burned by napalm, all kinds of destruction, POWs signaling torture with their eyes, a war brought right to everyone's living room. How to make sense of all this now? The only answer, even acknowledging that people can interpret the same facts differently, is to try to go to the most solid, verifiable facts that you can find. Forget all the things that everyone knows. Put aside the dramatic images and look for the facts as best they can be found, and examine how those who have done the careful research and who appear to be reasoningly as objectively as possible have done their analyses. Today you will hear from three of the most qualified professional historians there are in the field. As they speak, you may have questions come to your mind that you would like to have them answered. Please fill out the question cards that are available. We only need your name and which presenter, if you pick one that you wish to question, and the questions. After the lunch break, we will reconvene and go through the questions and answers and provide responses. Some of the comments, we not only have the three distinguished historians who will be presenting today here, we have a number of other historians here, both American-born and Vietnamese-born. So some questions you may bring up later this afternoon might be answered by someone else who's even closer to that subject. Also, I think it's important to understand this was not our war. This was the war between South Vietnam and North Vietnam, in which the South had no designs in the North, but the North was determined to conquer the South under the banner of communism. We were allied with the South, but while 58,000 Americans died in the conflict, over 250,000 South Vietnamese military died. Many more were wounded, and tens of thousands of civilians were assassinated as part of the terror campaigns. We only have a few books from South Vietnamese authors which present their own view of events, and they certainly deserve to be considered as well. With that, I will thank you for coming, and all of the AVVBA groups for having the initiative to set this up, and all the work that members have done to make this a reality. Your first speaker is Dr. Robert Turner, who has a truly unique set of experiences and qualifications. He published his first commentary on the Vietnam War as a letter to the editor in the Paris edition of the New York Times in August 1964. We're talking way back, okay? He wrote a 450-page undergraduate honors thesis on the war in 1966-67. He was the director of research for National Student Committee for Victory Vietnam. He took part in more than 100 debates, teaching in panels. He doesn't take part in many of them anymore because nobody on the other side is willing to get anywhere near him in a debate. He spent 5 different periods in Vietnam between 68 and 75, right to the end. Served twice in the air as an Army lieutenant and a captain on detail for MACV in the North Vietnamese Viet Cong Affairs Division of the American Embassy. He's written several books on the war, many articles, presentations, and again, nobody wants to argue with him. We had a conference held by VVFH a couple of years ago in DC. We invited all kinds of famous anti-war people to participate, and we heard back. We're still waiting to hear back. With that, I will turn you over to Dr. Robert Turner.
First of all, to all of the Vietnam veterans in the group, thanks for your service and welcome home. I have an unusual perspective on Vietnam, having spent years in the early days of the war, traveling around the country and debating professors and leaders of SDS and other organizations. I was involved in over 100 debates and similar programs. Every time I heard the same litany of arguments, all of which were false, save for the argument that war is a horrible thing and good people get killed in war. So nobody likes war. But if you don't stand up to aggression, we learned at Munich that the cost can be far greater once you empower the aggressors. There was a big debate in the 1960s over whether we were protecting South Vietnam from foreign aggression or interfering in a civil war and propping up a dictator and so forth. The good news is that's no longer debatable. After Hanoi published its official history of the war, translated into English by a member of the Vietnam Veterans for Factual History, there cannot be any question. They documented in tremendous detail that on May 19th, 1959, Ho Chi Minh's birthday, Hanoi made a decision to open the Ho Chi Minh Trail and start pouring troops, supplies, and equipment and weapons down through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam, down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was as much aggression as any other war we have ever fought, even though it was covert aggression. It was not until 5 years later, on August 7th, 1964, that Congress enacted the equivalent to a declaration of war, what we today call an authorization for the use of military force, empowering the president to use armed force as he deemed necessary to protect the protocol states of the 1955 SEATO Treaty. Those states were the state of Vietnam, which we knew as South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. That's right, Congress authorized the use of force in Cambodia at the time it did Vietnam, despite the fact that critics complained when we sent troops into Cambodia, which helped us win the war. Some people tried to argue, wait a minute, Vietnam was only temporarily divided at the Geneva Conference, and so it was perfectly permissible for one zone to use force to reunite the country. So that doesn't do very well when we recall the Korean War. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United Nations Security Council met denounced it as an international aggression, and empowered the United States to lead an international force under the UN flag to protect South Korea. You cannot make a credible legal case that the Vietnam War was either unconstitutional or illegal. If you have doubts about that, our center hosted a conference on April 29th, 2000, on 25th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. And we decided we would repeat the old Vietnam debates. And so we contacted the very best international law and constitutional law scholars who had opposed the war back in the 60s and said, hey, let's get together and re-argue those issues, but in light of the evidence we now have, what Hanoi has provided us. We went more than 6 deep in each area before anybody would touch it. They can't make the case. We did finally find 2 very lightweight people to debate it, and this book has the transcript of those debates. I debated the constitutional law issues. My opponent made an opening statement, and when his time for rebuttal came, he basically said, that's all I've got. It's just, the idea that it was an illegal war is absolutely wrong. Now, another major point, we did not lose the Vietnam War on the battlefields of Vietnam. Indeed, we did not lose a single major battle during the war. This is less a commentary of the lack of courage and ability of our opponents than it was in the fact that we had superior air power, and any time they decided to stay and fight, we clobbered them and we destroyed them. But by 1968, the National Liberation Front / Viet Cong, which had been a creature of Hanoi from the beginning, virtually ceased to exist. They had been destroyed by the Tet Offensive and the May 1968 offensive. An old late friend of mine, Harry Summers, wrote a book called On Strategy, and in the beginning he opens with this exchange. You never defeated us on the battlefield, the American colonel said, and that colonel was Harry Summers, by the way. The North Vietnamese colonel responded, that may be so, but it's also irrelevant. And both men were right. I worked in the North Vietnam Viet Cong Affairs Division of the embassy during my 2 military tours. They created a job called Assistant Special Projects Officer for me. And Douglas Pike worked in that same office 3 times. We alternated between the 2 of us. And Doug wrote, I believe future historians will say not only could the war have been won, but that we had it won. Bill Colby, an old and dear friend, he was the CIA station chief in Saigon in the late 1950s, came back and he was a number 3 civilian in Vietnam throughout much of the war, went on to be the director of Central Intelligence, the head of the CIA. He wrote a wonderful book called Lost Victory, and he used to come down every year to speak to my Vietnam War seminar at UVA Law School. And he noted that the big test was the Spring '72 offensive, also known as the Easter Offensive, although not by the North Vietnamese. They didn't care much about Easter. But Bill Colby says on the ground in South Vietnam, the war had been won. And I think he is exactly right. That's a photo of Bill and my colleague John Norton Moore, who was the leading international law scholar supporting the war. Another old friend of mine, Robert Elegant, wrote a fascinating article called How to Lose a War. You can find it if you Google that title. It's been copied and put on the internet. And he says South Vietnam and American forces actually won the limited military struggle. John Lewis Gaddis is a professor of history at Yale. He wrote a 2-part series for Foreign Affairs. And he said historians now acknowledge American counterinsurgency operations in Vietnam were succeeding during the final years of the war. Sadly, we lost the support of the American people, and that was not enough. John Gaddis is often referred to as the dean of American diplomatic historians. After the war ended, Hanoi admitted it had lost more than 1 million troops in the war, nearly 4 times the total loss of the South Vietnamese, American, and Allied forces combined. Now, why was it important to go to war to protect South Vietnam from communist aggression? After World War II, General Eisenhower was concerned that the American people would not tolerate spending large sums of money on military. And he decided to cut back our ground forces, where we were already overwhelmingly overpowered by the Soviet Empire. They had several times more tanks than we had, more artillery pieces, more divisions, but Ike said after Korea, we don't want to match China man for man in a land war in China. What we want to do is deter war, and we're going to do that by responding to future aggression at a time and manner of our own choice. And Mr. Khrushchev, in case you're not listening, look around Moscow and see what you want to see glowing for the half-life of uranium-235. Don't mess with us. And it worked with Khrushchev. He backed down. He said, now is not the time for armed struggle. But that's where our friend Mao Zedong comes in. And also the other thing that came in is Eisenhower's strategy worked great when we had an overwhelming preponderance of nuclear power. But the communists, they had a few nuclear weapons, but nothing that could match us. But as Moscow's arsenal increased, then the issue became, is America really going to trade New York and Chicago and Atlanta to save Saigon? And that was very dubious. But Mao came along and said, yes, in appearance, the imperialists are very fierce. But we are going to use people's warfare, what Moscow called wars of national liberation. We are going to send in advisors and money and weapons to train guerrillas who will then fight among the people. They would live among the people, work among the people, and when appropriate, take up arms and fight. So if you decide to use nuclear weapons, for every guerrilla you kill, you're going to kill hundreds of totally innocent people. The Americans are not that foolish, and their allies are not that foolish. They would never tolerate that. And thus, Mao said, nuclear weapons are irrelevant. And Vietnam became a test case of this. Indeed, Lin Pao, the vice chair of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, gave a very important speech that was published in a document called Long Live the Victory of People's Wars, in which he said, the future of the world revolution will be determined on the battlefields of Vietnam. He said, once the Vietnamese have proven that American counterinsurgency techniques will not work, then we will have many Vietnams all over the third world. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro's top military advisor, said the future of the struggle, for the revolutionary struggle in the Americas, will be decided on the battlefields of Vietnam. Moscow and Beijing had a big feud going on at this point. And one of the issues was whether it was appropriate to move to armed struggle. Khrushchev said no, Mao said yes. Had we walked away from Vietnam in 1964, 1965, we would have proven that Mao was right, that we did not have an answer to these kinds of threats, and we might actually have seen the reunification of the communist empire, with Moscow saying, okay, we don't have to worry about American intervention. Throughout the third world, there were dissident groups who wanted power. If they saw that by siding with the communists they could get power, they would think, okay, we'll get their money and their guns and their training, and then when we get power, we'll throw them out. Never happened that way, because the communists always made sure they got the key ministries, like the defense ministry and the treasury. The interior, of course, in this country, the Interior Department takes care of our national parks, and most of the world, it's the internal police. And there's not a single case where a group accepted the aid of a communist, and the communists did not come out on top after victory. Now, another point I'm not going to dwell on, but very important, we fought most of the Vietnam War with one hand tied behind our backs. And that totally undermined deterrence. It encouraged Hanoi. It demoralized the hell out of our troops, and it turned many Americans against the war. In 1968, in the New Hampshire primary, McCarthy almost got a majority of the votes. It shocked everyone. It led LBJ to decide not to run for re-election. And it later turned out that a majority of the people who voted for McCarthy went on to vote for George Wallace and Curtis LeMay. They were super hawks casting protest votes over our no-win policies in Indochina. Another old friend of mine, Bob Elligan, and Bob and I were on a panel at the Texas Tech Vietnam Center that Steve Sherman put together, I think 2 years ago, talking about the media in Vietnam. And Bob wrote an excellent article called How to Lose a War. If you Google that title in quotes, you'll find it's been put on the internet by at least 2 groups. And it is a damnation of the role of the media at undermining public support for the war. And candidly, I shared that view. There were some outstanding journalists in Vietnam, but there also were an awful lot of hacks that had no idea what was going on. And there were a number of people who went there because they thought the war was a horrible thing. We can discuss this more during Q&A. Now, it's important to understand Hanoi's strategy. They understood they could not defeat the United States military in a war, and they never intended to. They had a multifaceted struggle. See, Americans tend to think that if you've got a military problem, you go to the Pentagon, an economic problem, maybe you go to Treasury, Commerce. The communists understood that struggle is like an orchestra. You've got your percussion and your strings and your wind and your horns and so forth. You play them all together. And they understood that in addition to the military struggle, there is also the political struggle, which was critical in Vietnam. When they went to war against France in 1947, the Viet Minh had a very effective propaganda campaign inside France, telling the French people to oppose the war, to block troop trains and so forth. And they defeated the French. They won the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in the sense that they overran it, but they suffered several times more fatalities than the French did, even counting the French troops who died on the forced march back to Hanoi. To say that Dien Bien Phu was in any meaningful sense a military victory for the Viet Minh is simply not true. But it was an incredible political defeat. It brought down the Linnell government in Paris. The Chinese advisors, the whole game here was logistics. Everybody knew, Dien Bien Phu was surrounded by mountains, but it was all triple canopy jungle and so forth. There's no way you could get artillery in there. And thus, small arms fire was not going to have an effect, on the base. You might occasionally pick someone off, but you're shooting at, a mile away or so. But Giap organized tens of thousands of laborers. They built roads. They took apart artillery pieces and strapped them onto bicycles and so forth. And it was a brilliant logistics move. They put the artillery the Chinese had given them after China fell to Mao, and they put it on a direct fire mode, firing straight down the mountain into the airfield. Dien Bien Phu was totally dependent upon aviation for resupply. Once you put a few big craters in that landing, in that airfield, nobody's going to land there more than once, let's put it that way. And so the Viet Minh dug tunnels to right outside the French perimeter. And when the French dropped, parachuted in supplies, as often as not, it missed the target and a hand went up and dragged it down and the Viet Minh had dinner for 2 weeks. The game was over. Les jours sont faits, as the French say. And then the Chinese military advisors say, hold it, Giap, hold it. Wait, we will tell you when to take the camp. And French and European newspapers, day after day, front page stories, Dien Bien Phu still holds on. And the day before the Geneva conference, which had been discussing Korea, took up Indochina, they overran Dien Bien Phu. Banner headline, Dien Bien Phu falls. The Linnell government fails. Pierre Mendès France, a socialist, worked with the communists and set up a coalition after promising to bring peace in Indochina within 30 days or he would resign his position. The reason they beat the French was because of political warfare. Now, I talk about this in my 1975 book, Vietnamese Communism. If you can find a copy of that, you're luckier than I am. There are not a lot of copies out there, but it has a lot of information on this whole history. They did the same thing to us. They used propaganda. Moscow, Beijing, Havana all helped in. And I heard these same arguments at virtually every debate and program. The U.S. first got involved to restore French colonial rule after World War II. Absolutely not true. We actually prohibited American merchant ships from carrying troops or supplies from France to Vietnam. We favored liberation, or the freedom, the end of colonial rule. They said that we violated the Geneva Accords. Not true at all. We didn't sign anything at Geneva, nor did South Vietnam, on the issue of the so-called reunification elections in 1956. Our position, spelled out very clearly, was that we would only support elections if they were supervised by the United Nations to ensure that they were conducted fairly. You have to remember that North Vietnam got a majority of the population. Molotov, the head of the Soviet delegation and co-chair of the Geneva Conference, said that would be interfering in the internal affairs of the Vietnamese people to have supervision. Ho actually had some bogus elections in the north where there were soldiers at the voting booths to help people mark their ballots. Indeed, China was funding guerrillas and training them and supplying them throughout Southeast Asia and as far away as Mozambique and Africa. By holding on for a decade, we bought time for Thailand and Indonesia to become stronger and for the PRC to turn inward during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, during which Lin Pao crashed in a helicopter, they tell us, and by the time that ended, they were no longer exporting revolution. Had we abandoned Indochina in '64, my guess is we would have soon had the option of using nuclear weapons, the only way we could possibly have dealt with several Vietnams, they're just too expensive, or losing the Cold War one country at a time. If you have any doubts about the evil nature of communism, the Black Book of Communism was written by some very left-wing European intellectuals, many of whom had been active communists, who had realized what an evil system it was, and their conclusion was that during the 20th century, 80 to 100 million people died as a direct result of communism. We have repeatedly extended an invitation to anyone on the left who wants to debate the morality, the legality, the policy wisdom of our war in Indochina. Nobody has accepted, not a single one. The offer remains open. For those of you who served in Vietnam, thank you for your service. Welcome home. And let me stop there. I do look forward to questions after lunch.
Let's check on one detail that would be nice to know. Just out of curiosity, would everybody who's a Vietnam veteran please stand up? And just out of curiosity, do we have any other veterans here? All right. Because there were people after us. Thank God for them. Just out of curiosity, who came the furthest to get here? There's some people from California. Anybody from any place further than California?
It's further than California.
I don't see anybody. Okay, I guess the California guys have got it. Where's the Australian guy? I don't see him. All right. The next speaker is Dr. Michael Kort, who is from up in Boston area, who's got an interesting background in that originally he was part of the what we call the orthodox school, but he has this terrible problem. He hasn't adjusted to academia. He's kept an open mind. One can only sympathize. So he eventually started reading other materials, and he read Dr. Moyar's book, and that started him reading other stuff, and he has since kind of come to a different kind of reasoning about the history of the war. His book is one of the best new books ever on the war, the Vietnam War Re-Examined. There's a copy on the table out there. And if anybody wanted to get one, well, there's a lot of fairly good books on the war, but his is one that I particularly like personally. I have to say it's well worth acquiring and going through. It packs a lot, and it's pretty readable, and it's just really an outstanding piece of work. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kort.
Excuse me if I stare down a little bit into this, as I have to deal with that light in my face. It's a great honor for me to be invited to this symposium by those of you who fought this war, and especially by those of you who've continued in the decades since then to try to set the record straight. Thank you for inviting me. My task today is to give an overview, a summary of the debate over the war, especially as it goes between the so-called orthodox and revisionist schools. I can't cover the whole thing, obviously, so what I'm going to try to do is the following. First, give a very quick overview of the debate, then outline quickly the orthodox view and the revisionist view, then turn to the revisionist view and cover some key premises of that view. And then, having done that, I want to focus on a few things. Can't focus on everything, and you've already heard a brilliant exposition of the revisionist view. But I want to look a little at the American military effort in Vietnam as a whole, talk about Rolling Thunder and why it failed, talk a little about the ground war, especially between 65 and 68, and disagreements about that. And then last, talk about the situation as it existed in 1972 between what is called the lost victory, Colby's term, and Black April, the end of the war. The debate over Vietnam is multifaceted. It goes in many different places, but I think it comes down to two basic questions. The first, was it in America's national interest? And was it in America's national interest and correct for the United States to get involved in Vietnam and ultimately with its own military forces in order to save South Vietnam, to apply the American Cold War policy of containment to Southeast Asia to stop the spread of communist influence and, of course, Soviet influence. Secondly, once we got involved in that war, was it winnable? And specifically, when one talks about that, was it winnable at a price much less than was paid in defeat? The Orthodox view is called that because it got there first, in part because of many of the journalists who covered the war, like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan and others, and then because it was picked up in academia, and so many of most of the scholarly books initially were written by academics following Halberstam, Carnot, and the others. And very importantly, they wrote the textbooks too. The Orthodox view answers both questions in the negative. And this became, as we know, the accepted view, or the conventional wisdom, as one historian has called it, both in the country as a whole and even more so in academia, where the primary version was the war was a mistake, it was a tragedy, and it was unwinnable. Because of the texts that the textbooks that are out there, and most of the people who teach the war, anybody who goes to college today, is unlikely to encounter anything else but this view. And one other thing is that over time, in academia especially, an intolerance developed towards challenges to this. Nothing could better illustrate that than when Mark Moyar's book came out, his brilliant book, Triumph Forsaken, and the abuse that he faced after publishing it. The revisionist view answers both of the questions I just outlined positively. The argument is that the United States, first question, the United States got involved in Vietnam for a good reason in the context of the Cold War. I'll talk more about that. And the second premise, which essentially attempts to explain what went wrong, is that we did so without a real strategy for victory. And therefore we forfeited chances at various points that would have brought victory at a cost far less than was paid in defeat. Both the orthodox and the revisionist camps are very large, and so there are disagreements between them. And I'm actually going to talk about one of them within the revisionist narrative, which concerns the argument that the United States, revisionists will argue that the United States did have different options, different military options it could have used to win the war. One of the problems is that they don't always agree on what those options were. And in dealing with that, what for me was supposed to be a 18-month project turned into more than 3 years to get finished. Let me now turn to the orthodox view and try to summarize it very, very quickly. The war, of course, was a mistake. We shouldn't have done it, and once we got into it, it was unwinnable. It's based on a couple of premises, some of which you've heard about already, and I've heard them debunked already. One is that Ho Chi Minh and his comrades represented the only legitimate view of Vietnamese nationalism. And the second crucial premise is that the war in the South, although it ultimately was directed and controlled from Hanoi, began as a response to the injustices and inequalities of the Diem regime. The first premise has remained relatively consistent over time, although since Mark Moyar's book in particular and others, Diem is now given more credit as a nationalist. The second premise has not done as well. Initially, it was, of course, the war began as a rebellion in the South under Southern leadership, and not as a result of Hanoi, and in fact, even for a time against Hanoi's wishes. After the war, it became impossible to maintain something like that, and we got different versions of this. One of which, coming from one of the leading biographers of Ho Chi Minh, we get something like this. It was a genuine revolt based in the South, but organized and directed from the North, which if you listen to that, I don't have to continue on that point, but it's kind of like saying in the Korean War it was genuinely based in the South, but organized and directed from North Korea. It's obviously an oxymoron. And I'm glad you all saw that right away. This view, just to go on a little bit, prevails in the textbooks. I just want to mention two textbooks that are, I think, are the two leading textbooks, but the first one I know is the bestseller. It's by George Herring. It's called America, the Longest War. And if you read that, what you learn is this. The American effort, and these are quotations, is doomed from the start. The only hope for stability in Vietnam was revolutionary change. And containment, our policy since 1947, was misplaced, and that pretty much is clear without debate. Another book by a guy named George Donaldson Morse, it's called Vietnam, America's Ordeal, and I'll be referring to a lot of people during the course of this talk, says that the effort for South Vietnam was due to fail from the outset. South Vietnam, and this is a key point I'm going to come back to and end with, actually, because I think it's at the heart of the Orthodox case, could never become a viable nation state only communist triumph could bring peace to South Vietnam, and of course, containment was misplaced. Ho Chi Minh in this narrative is a nationalist first as well as a communist. One of the latest things I read on that was that he was a communist because he was a nationalist. You've already heard some about that. Indochina was not strategically important in the Cold War, did not merit American intervention. There's a rejection of the domino theory, and you've already heard about that from Bob Turner, that it was invalid, that the fall of one communist state wouldn't necessarily lead to another, and you've already heard the criticism of that, and it's something Mark Moyar also does in his book. Further, the United States did not appreciate the strength and determination of North Vietnam. We hear a lot about that, or the communist guerrillas in the South, or that the Marxist program that they had had strong nationalist content and therefore was very popular. Further, we didn't appreciate the weaknesses of our allies, or clients, as the word goes, in Vietnam, beginning with Diem and his successors, and therefore did not grasp their vulnerability to an insurgency that at its core was provoked by inequalities in South Vietnam. Again, I'll mention this because it's so important. South Vietnam was an American creation and lacked legitimacy and viability, and beyond that, the United States should have understood the limits of its power. In terms of the 1968 to 73, and again, I'm going to summarize real quickly, the United States, especially from 65 to 68, but even after that, fought a destructive war of attrition that could only lead to stalemate, and there's never really a consideration of were there any options. The bombing of South Vietnam could not break that stalemate and simply added to the destruction. And that area, if you look at least what some revisionists say, there are people who agree with that in terms of how our bombing should have been done. Especially when we talk to North Vietnam, the bombing of North Vietnam could not, and I'll get into this a little bit more, could not convince the North Vietnamese to stop their effort to conquer South Vietnam. Why? Because they were so determined and nothing was going to stop them. In terms of Tet, and I'm not going to talk about this, I'm sure most of you know a great deal about it. What did it demonstrate? It demonstrated, because of the 100 attacks, it demonstrated the futility of the American effort, communist losses, despite the fact that they suffered so severely, were replaceable. And from 1968 to 1972, yes, there was some improvement in the military situation, but basically the flaws of South Vietnam could not be corrected, and that basically is the orthodox perspective. Let me turn now to the military, to the revisionist perspective, and I want to begin by a few basic premises. First of all, you got to look at it within the context of the Cold War. Containment was a valid and necessary response to the communist threat, and Vietnam was one of several fronts in which the Cold War took place, in which containment had to be applied. This goes back, the argument is nothing new. I'm going to mention a couple of writers. The first is Gunther Lowy, who wrote the book America in Vietnam, and he pointed this out. He says, the fear of communism in the 50s and 60s was not irrational. The threat to Western Europe in the 1940s, right after the war, in 1947, brought forth the policy of containment. And then, as a result of one, the communist victory in China in 1949, the Sino-Soviet alliance in 1950, and of course, the Korean War of 1950, containment was extended to Asia. It's true, says Lowy, that Vietnam was not strategically vital, but its importance becomes clear when you look at it within the context of the Cold War. And just a word now, what was the Cold War? Let's define it for a second. And the person I'm going to use is somebody who didn't write a word about Vietnam. His name's Martin Moyar. He was an absolutely brilliant historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, which is my basic field. And this is what he said. He's just a great writer. The Cold War was the Third World War that never took place, but the stakes were just as high as in the two world wars. Michael Lind, who wrote Vietnam: A Necessary War, goes a little bit further than that, and he says the Cold War was the Third World War of the 20th century. On one level, a struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for military supremacy, but more important at its core level, a struggle between communist totalitarianism led by the Soviet Union and Western democratic capitalism led by the United States. It was at its core an ideological struggle. That said, it differed from the two world wars that followed, mainly militarily. The weapons that were available, of course, after World War II were nuclear weapons. But first of all, you could not fight this struggle in the main front, which was Europe, because in Europe, if you did it, it would lead to nuclear war. And one thing both sides understood, even when Stalin was alive, was that you cannot fight a nuclear war. So that meant that the struggle was shifted to peripheral areas, and especially in Asia. Mao Zedong, who knew something about this, pointed out that there were three fronts in Asia: Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And then what Michael Lind has described in a very nice pithy little quote, these areas, he said, were, let me just get it down there, these areas, he said, were not contested because they were important, but they were important because they were contested. And why were they important in this context? And for that, we got to go back to something that Bob Turner mentioned, which is Munich, the conference in 1938, where the French and the British caved into Hitler and essentially sacrificed Czechoslovakia, which at the time was non-strategic. Yet it was sacrificed in the hope that this would appease Hitler and war could be avoided. As everybody in this room knows, the Munich settlement led directly to war, and that is the lesson of Munich. The lesson of Munich is you have to stand up to aggression before you get to a general war. That is what President Truman did in 1947 in Greece. He did it again, having to send American combat troops, as we all know, in Korea in 1950. And so that was the lesson of Munich that is essentially a part of the revisionist narrative. The domino theory is valid, at least in certain cases. You've heard about that already today. Further, you've heard a lot about this already today. Ho Chi Minh was really not a nationalist, at least not in the generally understood sense of that word. He was a loyal agent of the Comintern, the Communist International, from the 1920s to basically his entire career until he returned to Vietnam in 1941 and took over that struggle directly. The second thing is really he was not a nationalist, a communist because he was a nationalist. When he became a communist, he essentially abandoned nationalism, started killing Vietnamese nationalists from the very beginning, and has the blood of thousands, tens of thousands of them on his hand. That's not much of a nationalist. In this narrative, in the narrative, the revisionist narrative, Diem is much better than advertised. Again, this is Mark Moyar has done as much as anybody to make that clear. His book was a revelation, certainly to me. And so are people like Nguyen Van Tu later on. I want now, let me just get this, to go a little deeper on this point, and this is really about the validity of nationalism beyond what Ho Chi Minh represented. And I want to point something out that what essentially I think you can say Diem represented. If you look at the first map over here, it shows you, and I'm now talking about some things that were pointed out very well by a historian at Cornell named Keith Weller Taylor. Vietnamese expanded southward over several several centuries. Didn't really get to the south there, all the way to the south until 1757. And the point that's been made about this by people who have looked at it is that as the Vietnamese expanded southward, those who moved south became different than people who lived in the north. They moved south, they lived under different conditions, and what Taylor says is the war of 1954 to 1975 reflects two different visions of the future of the country that have deep historical roots. So what you got is the people moving south, getting further away from their original homeland, living under different conditions, and developing a new outlook on life. This was intensified. People talk about Vietnam has always been united by the de facto existence of two separate states for about 2 centuries, from the late 1500s into the 1700s. Officially, there was a dynasty, but you really had two separate states. You look at the map, oddly enough, divided at the 17th parallel. And the existence of these two states intensified the differences. The people in the South, over time, became more individualistic, less passive, more self-reliant, and open to new ideas, ultimately Western ideas, and ideas of democracy. So really, and this is a part of an important part of the narrative, is that you certainly had alternate versions of legitimate nationalism, and I would argue far more legitimate than the communist one. Let me turn now to the American military effort and give an overview of that. In the revisionist narrative, it's not a matter of a hopeless war, but how the United States government managed the war and the limits it placed on the military it assigned to fight this war, which I think a lot of you in the audience know a lot about. This grew out of the concept of limited war, an idea that certainly made sense in the nuclear age. What did limited war, at least initially, meant? If you would have asked General Matthew Ridgway, who commanded our troops in Korea after MacArthur was removed, it meant a non-nuclear war. But there was no contradiction between limited war and using decisive military force to achieve an objective, to achieve your objective. The contrast is when certain theorists, mainly civilian ones, got a hold of this. And what you had instead of using decisive military force was using means less than a specific level, and decisive military victory was not going to be achieved or even sought. These folks drew on what is called systems analysis, which in turn draws on what is called cost-benefit analysis. And when applying this to war, you got what was called the rationalist approach, which the main exponent of that in the American government was Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson. And let me now just go over what this means. The actors in a military conflict, we're told, act rationally. Therefore, the United States should apply pressure, if it applied pressure carefully on North Vietnam and in a calibrated way, we could show them, and this was the thinking, that the war was not in their interest. This in turn would allow the United States to apply maximum pressure at minimum risks. The term was graduated pressure. Then Hanoi would calculate and stop supporting the Viet Cong in the South. The rationalist approach assumed that communists in Hanoi thought like the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and that graduated pressure initially by air power, and then eventually, when that didn't work, by sending troops, became the way that we, became basically our approach. And although, again, air power was the primary way. Let me tell you what H.R. McMaster, who many of you have heard of, was for a while, as you may know, the national security advisor to President Trump. This is what McMaster said about this. McNamara and his colleagues were convinced that the traditional military methods and force were unsuited to the current realities that they faced. McMaster points out that JFK's basic idea of flexible response, his basic foreign policy, assumed was different than graduated pressure. Flexible response meant applying military force at the necessary and appropriate level. Graduated pressure, what we did, meant starting low and gradually increasing pressure. McMaster points out that doing this in 1964 to 1965 led to the introduction of American combat troops, and as he puts it, precisely what it was designed to avoid. In terms of South Vietnam, the most familiar term that we hear is gradual escalation. What do some revisionist commentators think about this? I want to begin with Colonel Harry Summers, author On Strategy. And as Summers put it, it had a devastating effect on the United States military effort. Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, who was the overall commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific during the mid-60s, put it this way. It turned American pressure bombing on North Vietnam, as he puts it, into a series of nibbles that permitted them, the North Vietnamese, to build their defenses and anticipate every move we made. General Philip Davidson, who was a top aide to General Westmoreland and who wrote Vietnam at War, said that gradual escalation played into the hands of General Giap, who wanted to fight a long, drawn-out war, and that the signals we were sending, you're supposed to send signals with graduated pressure, were signs of American weakness. And of course, as the war dragged on, as we all know, support for it fell. The best summary of it comes from a gentleman named Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Morris. This is what he said about the American effort. Because of graduated pressure. It wasn't even gradual escalation, that is the gradual increase of force, but rather escalation and de-escalation, on again, off again, knee-jerk reactions that varied with the intuitive winds of Lyndon Johnson and his advisors. It was, says Admiral Sharp, a strategy for defeat. And so the basic American approach was problematic because of what went on in Washington. What I want to do now is cover, I want to move on, and I want to cover several things. First, I want to talk about Rolling Thunder, then the ground war, and then again from Lost Victory to Black April. I'll begin with Rolling Thunder. Well, everybody agrees that it failed, revisionists and orthodox both. They don't agree on why. According to the orthodox analysis, North Vietnam was not suitable to strategic bombing inherited from World War II. It had an agricultural economy. Supplies came from outside. And so its ability to wage war could not be limited and crippled and damaged as it was, of course, when we bombed industrialized countries like Germany and Japan. Interdiction was futile. The guerrillas in the South, at least initially, didn't need the supplies from the North, although most Orthodox historians will admit that this was only at the very beginning. By 1965, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was important, and by 1970 or 71, it was vital. Also, in terms of the bombing, we hear this all the time, the North Vietnamese were just too determined to discourage. What's the revisionist response? First of all, North Vietnam was vulnerable. And second, what I'll spend most of my time on, the response is an effort to explain the real reasons that this failed. Dale Walton, who wrote Vietnam, The Necessary War, does a real good job of turning the whole orthodox statement position on its head. He points out that North Vietnam was very vulnerable. to bombing. It had to import all of its materials, all of its war materials, basically from either the Soviet Union or China. Had we had the means to do this, closed down the port of Haiphong and other ports, we could have almost crippled the Soviet Union's ability to supply North Vietnam. Attacks on the railroads, on the highways, and the mining of internal waterways, properly done, could have seriously limited Communist China's supply as well. And attacks done on infrastructure beyond what we did, but on really the whole infrastructure of North Vietnam, according to Walton, and I think he's right, could have crippled North Vietnam's ability to wage war. Explaining the failure is more complicated. Let me begin with the message. Graduated pressure was designed to deliver a message that North Vietnam can't win the war and it's not in their interest and used through careful calibration. Well, one of the things that did, especially with the pauses that took place, is that it had the opposite effect. It strengthened North Vietnam's determination. What they saw in it was American weakness. So that was the first thing. Graduated pressure also allowed the North Vietnamese to prepare. They knew where we started, and again, if you look here, you can see on this how we gradually moved north, and the dates are there. And so, well, you didn't have to be a genius to know what was coming and when we were going to be coming. It allowed them to prepare, it allowed them to disperse their resources, and allowed them to get ready for the next attack. And perhaps worst of all, graduated response, graduated pressure, let the North Vietnamese build a very effective and modern and up-to-date air defense system. What were called rules of engagement made all of this worse, and they compounded the problems. And they were of two types, operational and geographic and operational. You can see it on the map, and I actually want to use this one, it's a little bit better. But we can start here. First of all, geographically, at least initially, and you can see it from the map here, right there. Key areas were out of bounds. And initially, the 19th parallel, nothing north of that, then the 20th parallel. Even when these restrictions were removed, certain areas were restricted and prohibited, and you see it clearly here by looking at the donuts. These maps are both pretty much the same, even then, even when the restrictions geographically were removed, you had these other restrictions as well. Operationally, targets that the military wanted to hit were not permitted by Washington, usually because they were designated civilians, at least by Washington. Other military targets near civilian areas, they were restricted to, or they couldn't be hit at all. The rules of engagement were often changed, they were complicated, and sometimes it was hard for our pilots to know exactly what they were. Above all doing this, or maybe not above all, but also doing this, what this did was prevent the implementation of Air Force doctrine, which called for damaging enemy forces and infrastructure by hitting vital targets in their heartland. You could not do this. Further, the rules of engagement violated two key military principles: security, never give your enemy an advantage, and obviously surprise. It was very easy to know what was going on. All of this was done against military advice, and it became, and if you read the memoirs, a very, very sore point with senior military officers. General John McConnell, who was the Air Force Chief of Staff during part of this time, wrote that the Rolling Thunder failed because of restrictions placed on the Air Force. I'm going to cite two analysts, two colonels who analyzed this later. One was a guy named Joseph Cerami, and he wrote that the slow squeeze succeeded only in preventing the attainment of American strategic objectives. And I want to read one more from that I cite in my book. It's said rather well. This man's name was Ellsworth, Colonel Ellsworth, and he said this: President Johnson showed he did not understand the inherent nature of air power as an offensive weapon. Bombing halts and ceasefires hindered a continuous and concentrated strategic bombing campaign. They allowed the North Vietnamese to reconstitute their forces, reestablish their lines of supply, and generally outlast the American effort. Again, perhaps worst of all, it allowed the building of the air defense network. And how this could be done, why we would allow such a thing, might escape most of you. And it's really tough to explain. But apparently it had to do, at least in part, with the signals we were sending. Back in 1965, when they started building these things, Westmoreland wanted to bomb them. And he had a meeting with one of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, McNaughton. And McNaughton said to him, no, you can't do it. They're not going to be used. Soviets are just trying to pacify the North Vietnamese. And this was reflected in a memo that McNaughton wrote to McNamara, which I assume McNamara agreed with. And this is what he wrote. We won't bomb the sites, and that will be a signal to North Vietnam not to use them. Two orthodox historians who wrote Leslie Gelb and Richard Betts, who wrote the book The Irony of Vietnam. They were orthodox historians, but as they wrote, kind of simply, McNaughton turned out to be wrong. The ROEs did other things. Our pilots weren't allowed to attack under all sorts of different circumstances. One incident where Navy pilots came across more than 100 SAMs being transported by railroad cars. They were not allowed to hit them. They couldn't fire on SAM bases until they were fired upon themselves. As one pilot put it, we had to fight them all, these 111 SAMs, I think it was, one at a time. Making matters worse, and you can see it again from these maps I have behind me, the SAMs, many of the SAMs were located less than 10 miles from Hanoi. In that case, they were safe. They were in that donut there. But they had a range of 27 miles, which meant, obviously, our planes attacking targets there were exposed. And I want to read what General William Moyar has said. He was the head of the 7th Air Force from 1966 to 1968. And I have a couple of quotes from him, but this is the first. As he put it, the SAMs could hit us whenever we came after one of the significant targets near Hanoi, but our rules of engagement prevented us in most cases from hitting back. Couldn't attack the main MiG base 20 miles from Hanoi until 1967. All of this is from Moyar. And not until 1966 was he allowed to attack the whole air defense system, the radars, the anti-aircraft guns, the SAMs, the MiGs, systematically. But even then, he couldn't attack the whole thing. As he put it, I was never allowed to attack the entire system. One of the reasons for this is that Johnson apparently feared that this might bring China into the war, or even the Soviet Union. But a number of revisionist historians who have written about this, and Mark is one of them, have pointed out that the chances for this were very, very low and were knowable at the time. And other historians, and there are two Chinese historians I've read on this, not going to mispronounce the names for you, have said essentially the same thing. So we outsmarted ourselves, it seems. All of this, of course, meant that interdiction, keeping the stuff from going down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, was very, very difficult. I'll go back to Moyar, and there he is with Johnson, and there's the famous quote about the outhouses. Moyar wanted, as you put it, he wanted to bomb, he wanted to close the port of Haiphong, to bomb the railroads, to really stop it all. But the Navy was not allowed under Johnson to attack Haiphong, and the Air Force, while allowed to bomb at least some of the railroads, was not allowed to bomb the largest bridges crossing the Red River, a crucial river, because of the fear of civilian casualties. And this is how Moyar sums it up, and I certainly can't do it any better. Effective, oh yeah, here it is. Waiting until the enemy has disseminated his supplies among thousands of trucks, sampans, rafts, bicycles, and then to send our multi-million-dollar aircraft after these individual vehicles. This is how to maximize our cost, not his. And that's what it did. Just want to sum up Rolling Thunder now. The fact that we hit, in the end, almost every target, there was originally a JCS list of 94 targets, in the end, and did massive destruction, really is in many ways irrelevant. And Walton points this out. Johnson did not allow the most lucrative targets to be hit, the key industrial infrastructure, the port of Haiphong, of course, key bridges, and for that matter, the seat of government. The bombs, and here I'm following a book called Gradual Failure by Jacob Van Staveren, which I think is the definitive book on 1965 Rolling Thunder. The bombs fell on less important targets. Our combat pilots took risks over and over again by striking relatively unimportant targets. You've heard a little about Mr. Pike, who was our leading expert on the Viet Cong. And in 1983, he was at a conference, and I think some of the people in this room might have been there, where Pike was asked about this, and he said, you know, if we'd have done what we did with the Christmas bombing in 1965, there's a good chance we could have ended the war in 1965. Hu Chin, who has been mentioned, the Vietnamese colonel, the North Vietnamese colonel who accepted the surrender in Saigon in 65 and then eventually defected, he wrote this. Expanding in slow stages didn't worry us. We had plenty of time to prepare. It wasn't the problem. And John Correll, who of the Air Force Association, is a leading member of that, put it this way. I think it's the best epitaph that I can come up with. Rolling Thunder was not built to succeed, and it didn't. Let me turn now to the ground war, search and destroy. And here, really, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the disagreement among revisionists because it is significant. The debate among revisionists is over the importance of the guerrilla insurgency versus the assertion that what the United States faced was a standard invasion, a conventional war. In other words, what kind of war was North Vietnam fighting to conquer South Vietnam? I want to stress here that the revisionists who talk about guerrilla insurgency and drawing its strength from peasant discontent are not making the same argument as the orthodox historians, who essentially argue that we had no alternative. Yes, we fought this ground war as we did between 65 and 68, but there was no alternative. The revisionists are revisionists precisely because they argue that we did have options. The ones who argue, for counterinsurgency and emphasis counterinsurgency argue that we did have options. Basically what they are critics of search and destroy and General Westmoreland. And this was centered, for those of you who are in the Marines, although you have Army people who criticized it too. Anyhow, there are two poles in this debate, as I see it, both by Army colonels. One is represented by Andrew Kuprenovich, who wrote The Army in Vietnam, and the other, of course, Colonel Harry Summers, who wrote on strategy. And let me try to go through it as quickly as I can. How am I doing time-wise? Okay. The argument for focusing on counterinsurgency among revisionists goes back to the beginning. Colonel Lansdale, who was an advisor to Diem, John Paul Vann, who many of you have heard of, and later David Hackworth. What Koprenovich blames is what he calls the Army concept, the idea of conventional war using massive firepower inherited from World War II and the Cold War. And he argues the United States should have focused first and foremost on the internal threat to guerrilla insurgency. Not just on main force, large guerrilla units, but on the smaller ones and on the political infrastructure. He argues that this caused us to miss opportunities to do counterinsurgency. And had we done this, we could have done this at a cost low enough to permit a continued presence in Vietnam. Others who have argued something similar to this are Gunther Lowy, in his book that came out in '78, Lieutenant Colonel John Nagel, who wrote a book called Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, in which he blamed what he called the institutional culture of the Army and the use of what he called the hammer of firepower in divisions. And I think it's fair to say Lewis Sorley, who pointed out that General Abrams, Creighton Abrams, learned from these mistakes and did much better. The other poll is from Colonel Summers. What he writes is this. He writes that the United States responded as if it was an insurgency and made a mistake. And he calls search and destroy an intense form of counterinsurgency. We turned our attention, he says, because the source is in the north, to the symptom or the screen. The source was North Vietnam. We should have isolated the battlefield. We should have cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail with American and ARVN troops at the 17th parallel. And also, he says we should have at least used the threat of invasion to deter the South and force the North Vietnamese to keep their armies, on their side of the border. The flaw in what we did, he argued, was we allowed the North Vietnamese to control the war. This put us on the strategic defensive, waiting on events. Now, here's something I think, at least that I found interesting. Isolating the battlefield, of course, is not a new idea. General Westmoreland drew up plans in 1964. The JCS, Joint Chiefs of Staff, before this in 1965. And what emerges, I think, in this is that the idea of isolating the battlefield, it's not an either-or debate between people like Koprenovich and people like Summers. And in fact, it brings them together. And my example of this is, and there he is, Colonel Victor Krulak, the Marine leader, very famous person, very interesting guy, who was a strong critic of Westmoreland and Search and Destroy. He told Averell Harriman, the Assistant Secretary for Far Eastern Affairs, early on, and the quote is up there, Harriman says, "What do I do? Mine and destroy the Port of Haiphong, destroy the rail lines, destroy the power, fuel, and heavy industry." This is, again, from somebody who's talking about counterinsurgency. The well-known Proven study, P-R-O-V-N study, which also advocated more attention to counterinsurgency, also, as Andrew Bertle, an expert on counterinsurgency, has pointed out, recommended that the bulk of American forces should go against the base areas, as he put it, and the lines of communication, meaning base areas, the safe zones in Laos and Cambodia, where the communists could always retreat to when they had to, and lines of communication, obviously, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Bu Tin, always useful, said, Hanoi was thinking about this, and as Bu Tin wrote, the greatest fear in Hanoi was that we would cut just a small part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He quotes one person telling him, "I'm scared to death they're going to do this," and that guy was the general in charge of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It gets a little more complicated, actually, when you look at this, when you look at the thinking of some other military historians, and I want to talk about a man named Dale Andrade, who I found very interesting, and I want to talk a little about what he said. And what this does is it muddies the waters a little bit, distinction between counterinsurgency and conventional warfare. What Andrade writes, and I think convincingly, is that what we faced is not simply a guerrilla war or a conventional war, but as he calls it, simultaneous guerrilla and main force war. And to ignore one or the other, he says, was doomed to failure. That's why he defends what General Westmoreland did after he got there in June of '64. He said, says Andrade, Westmoreland had to respond to the main force units he faced in 1964 when he took over. What he faced, says Andrade, was a perfect insurgency, a guerrilla war supported by troops and supplies, as we know, from North Vietnam. This, of course, is critical of Krpanovich, but it's also critical of Summers, who criticizes Westmoreland for doing too much counterinsurgency with search and destroy. Says Andrade, Westmoreland had to do it given the military situation. Yes, it was attrition, and yes, it couldn't bring victory, but now we come to the key point, what I started with earlier. What's the roots of this? The roots of this, he says, were in Washington. On what Andrade calls the strategic limits that our military was faced with. They could not go into Cambodia, they could not go into Laos, and North Vietnam, at least in terms of any kind of ground action, was off limits as well. A political scientist named Christopher Gasick, who studied this, calls then search and destroy the residual strategy. That is what was left. Says Andrade, all this, the restrictions from Washington, gave North Vietnamese an unbeatable advantage. And then he ups it further. Then he says, when you add in the support from China and from the Soviet Union, you had an unprecedented advantage. The North Vietnamese, as I think everyone in this room knows, could attack South Vietnamese and our soldiers over and over without the threat of significant retaliation. That said, it can be argued, and I think there's something to this, that all of it worked anyhow. And why is that? I think that comes when you look at the reason for the Tet Offensive, which essentially was a change in the strategy of North Vietnam. And you don't change strategies if things are going your way. Basically, by 1966-67, Hanoi was frustrated and worried. And among the people who have written about this in some detail, historians, or Jacob Wirtz, Colonel James Wilbanks has written a number of books on Vietnam, General Davidson, and interestingly, another historian, Colonel Gregory Daddis, who basically supports the orthodox position. And even he writes that by 1966, Hanoi had lost the initiative in South Vietnam. Hu Chin, always come back to him, writes that by 1967 in Hanoi they felt that something really spectacular had to be done. Therefore, we get the Tet Offensive, a huge gamble, and as Bob Turner has pointed out, and others as well, a gamble that failed. I'm not going to discuss Tet, you've already heard a lot about it. What I want to do now, and the last major thing I'm going to cover, is to turn to what I call going from lost victory, so it was in Kobe's term, to Black April, the fall of South Vietnam. And what I want to look at is what was achieved very briefly between 1968 and 1972, and what we can learn from the Easter Offensive. And again, even among revisionists, there's no unanimity here. There are some differences of views. The Orthodox, however, say this. The reason for And so what is the reason for the 1972 Spring Offensive? And what that is, just to review, it was, and you can see it there, a three-pronged invasion, strictly conventional, no different than what happened in Korea, of northern troops hitting from north, the middle, and the south, an attack on South Vietnam, strictly conventional with modern weapons, tanks, artillery, the whole bit. Why did they do this? The fulcrum for balancing the debate on what was achieved anyhow is the reason that they launched this offensive. The Orthodox give external reasons. They say because of the American Nixon's policy of détente, improving relations with Russia primarily, but also with China in 1972, they were worried that they might lose support as détente developed. In other words, external. They assumed the internal situation really hadn't improved in any significant way. Revisionists see significant improvement, but don't always agree on precisely how much. Echoing people like John Paul Vann and Sir Robert Thomson, the British expert from that time, Lewis Sorley, William Colby, Rufus Phillips, and others see great and significant improvement in Vietnamization, turning over the war, pacification, rooting out the Viet Cong infrastructure in the countryside. There are others who can talk, Mark Morris certainly can talk more about this. General Davidson is a little less, is somewhat less optimistic, and there are others who see it the same way. I think that the case for significant improvement, for dramatic improvement, is strengthened when you look at the North Vietnamese decision to launch the invasion of 1972. And again, this was a real change in strategy, and you don't change strategy unless your old strategy isn't working. And I want to cite several supporters of this. The first is Robert Thomson, who was the British expert who defeated the communists in Malaya way before Vietnam. And he said right after the invasion took place, this was a result of the success of Vietnamization and pacification. It caused the North Vietnamese to invade. William Colby, in his book, he writes about a trip he took with actually John Paul Vann, and they drove across the whole Mekong Delta on motorcycles. They had somebody up above just to make sure. But they said it was a different world. You could cross the whole Mekong Delta now, and you could be safe, and it was peaceful. And it was to get rid of that different world that the North Vietnamese launched their invasion. Third, and this is an Orthodox historian, his name is William Turley, but he's better than some of the others, I think. And he quotes Le Duc Tho, who was the chief negotiator at Paris for years on the North Vietnamese side, in a memo right before the invasion, saying that this was to defeat Vietnamization. Sorley quotes more from him and describing the situation in 1969 and 1970, and this is what Le Duc Tho said. Our bases were weakened, our positions shrank, our main forces, get this, decimated. That's from an Orthodox. Well, that's from Lewis Sorley. And fifth, somebody who studied this in great detail, Colonel Wilbanks, and he informs us that in the debates in Hanoi, some people wanted to wait for us to leave. The Americans are going. Why don't we just wait? Others were worried about Vietnamization, about the increasing strength of the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army, and the success of pacification. One of them was the boss by now, Le Duan, and he argued that waiting, despite the fact the Americans were leaving, will make it more difficult to conquer South Vietnam. If the situation was dramatically better in 1962, what can we learn from the Easter Offensive? And again, there is some disagreement even within the revisionist camp. First of all, the orthodox, they write, you needed American support to defeat this invasion, which we did at just an enormous cost to the North Vietnamese. They had 100,000 casualties, the great bulk of their very modern force that they sent in. But still, the orthodox argument goes, what this shows, if you needed American support, the situation was hopeless, it hadn't improved enough. That's that. Among the revisionists, you get these comments, and they vary one from another. Summers called it disastrous for North Vietnam, as it was. But then he writes, and as he has with Tet, a tactical defeat for them militarily, but a strategic success because it undermined American will. And we'll come to this again. Davidson sees pluses and minuses, but he writes this was a very severe test that they passed, although he said the real test would come later. Dale Andrade writes this, and it kind of brings things together. He said, yes, the ARVN needed American firepower. There's no question about that. Colby and Sorley are the most positive. Both use a variation of the phrase, the war is won. What they mean by that, and I'm going to now be talking about Sorley, what they mean by that is that with the proper American support, the war was won. The South Vietnamese could have held out. And what he does to strengthen this argument, and I think it's pretty compelling, he says, look at the other two countries that were divided by the Cold War, West Germany and South Korea. And our support for them never ended. In fact, we kept 300,000 troops in West Germany, because West Germany couldn't defend itself. And we kept about 50,000 troops in South Korea, then gradually somewhat less. We didn't end our support for them, even with American troops. What are we expecting South Vietnam to carry on without American support? And he's very scathing about this. Of course, as everybody in this room knows, that support was not forthcoming. Not just in terms of American forces leaving, but because American aid decreased. And that brings me to the last major issue I'm going to talk about, which is the causes or blame for Black April, what happened in 1975. And if you look at the two maps, the strategy is basically the same, except in 75 they succeeded. What do the Orthodox say about the reason? They don't deny that to some extent, to paraphrase Colonel Wilbanks's book, that we abandoned Vietnam. To some extent we did. Even Orthodox historians will accept that, some of them. But the main problem, they say, was that South Vietnam was hopeless. If problems hadn't been fixed, it was still not viable. Revisionists, for the most part, reject this. And those who assign more blame to the South Vietnamese generally say this is because of things we had done before or failed to do before. In other words, by 1975, our failures up till then made the situation untenable. What I want to do is just focus on one thing. I want to focus on the question of aid and what happened, and the relative aid given by the United States and the Chinese and the Soviet Union, but especially the Soviet Union. Orthodox historians will say this. One of them says both sides were famished because aid decreased. Another, and this is Turley actually, he's saying while you can't fully compare the money numbers and value, there's no doubt, as he puts it, about American generosity as compared to the Soviet Union and China. I think there are enormous problems with this, and what I want to do is, again, just focus on the question of aid and the numbers, because it's not just a matter of how much you gave, it's a matter of need. What did each side need after 1973? Soviet aid did decrease in 1973 and into 74, when at the end of the year it spiked. Well, there's good reason for that. North Vietnam needed much less aid. The Americans were no longer in the war. There was no air war to be fought. And fully a third of all the aid North Vietnam got from the Soviet Union was the sophisticated equipment to maintain their air defenses. And it's more than a third if you count all the ammunition, the air defense ammunition. Once the North Vietnamese didn't have to fight that, they didn't need all that aid, and what they were able to do in 1975 is send a lot of these anti-aircraft stuff down south, where they took a heavy toll on the South Vietnamese Air Force. So they needed much less. The person who does the most thorough job of this was a gentleman, Colonel William LeGros, who wrote a book called Vietnam from Ceasefire to Capitulation. And he points out something else in terms of needs. North Vietnam, he said, was on the offensive. It could accomplish its objectives with much less ammunition and equipment than the South, because it could focus, it could concentrate on selected targets. The South Vietnamese, and you can look at the border, had to protect a huge area, now without the Americans, populated areas, bridges, roads, and this 800-mile flank exposed to the North Vietnamese, its western border there, an 800-mile flank, which it had a lot of mountains and very heavy vegetation, meaning that the South Vietnamese, further that, the Ho Chi Minh Trail gave the North Vietnamese interior lines. The South Vietnamese had to move their troops very quickly, unlike the North, and for that they required expensive equipment that was very difficult to maintain, helicopters, planes, and the rest. That's why George Veith, who wrote the book Black April, that covers this in great detail, writes, I think trying to be polite, that making money comparisons between the aid we gave and the aid the Soviet gave, and everybody knows we decreased our aid and inflation ate away at a lot of it, to make money comparisons, as he put it, is disingenuous. Go beyond that. After 1973, we no longer could have advisors to the South Vietnamese Army, but before the 1975 offensive, North Vietnam's leading generals went to the Soviet Union, where they studied how to combine and work together with infantry, armor, and artillery, a flaw that they had demonstrated in the 1972 offensive. The American aid cut further was based on a ceasefire that never materialized, I think, as everybody knows. Instead, we had what one French expert called the most murderous truce, continuing fighting. And the result of the cuts, as General Davidson put it, was devastating. That the R-band collapsed in 1975 is hardly a surprise against this background. George Veith's book, which really deserves reading, is interesting because he argues that the South Vietnamese did a lot better than they're usually given credit for, even by revisionists. And his book, therefore, makes very interesting reading, certainly did to me. I have one more point, and then I'm done. You've heard this already from Bob Tucker. The regime that took over Vietnam in 1975, and especially when you look at Cambodia and everything else, and what it did and what it was like, its inefficiencies, its brutalities, and all the rest, is often used by revisionists, as it should be, in the debates to discredit the orthodox case. I want to go a little bit further, though, to what I consider the heart of the orthodox case, and that is again, that North Vietnam had legitimacy because of Ho and stuff I talked about before. And that South Vietnam, and now I'm quoting these folks, or one of them in particular, wrote a textbook on it, was a pseudo-nation, a counterfeit creation. Is this true? Well, all these years later, if you look at a map today, you're going to find a lot of countries like South Vietnam. You're going to find countries with bigger problems in South Vietnam. What are they doing there if South Vietnam was not viable, was an American creation? Well, what about communism? Well, back in 1975, communist countries, and I mean countries with communist systems, economic systems, governed or ruled about a third of the world's population. What do they rule today? Real communist systems. You got two countries left. You got Cuba, and you have the dystopian North Vietnam, excuse me, North Korea. Not the rest. Where's the Soviet Union? It's defunct. It is, as one of its two founders, Leon Trotsky, put it in denouncing others, it has been consigned to the dustbin of history. Communist China is on the map. They call it the People's Republic of China. But there's no socialism there anymore. There's no communism there. They have what we would call, I think, state capitalism. I teach a lot of students from China, and a lot of them in America these days. And when you talk about socialism in China, they just kind of smile. They know they're not supposed to say anything, but no one takes it. These are very wealthy kids, you know. And by the way, they all speak perfect, unaccented, colloquial English. They've spent large parts of their lives outside of China. It's really interesting. They call it the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, but as we know, at about the time they junked socialism in China, or communism in China in the 1980s, they did the same in Vietnam. You don't have it anymore. It's gone. They can call themselves that, but there is no communism there. Swept away in Eastern Europe. In Laos, they say they're socialist, but they're not. Cambodia's a monarchy again. What happened? Well, it turns out, I think at least, that it was communism that was not viable. It collapsed on its own because it could not provide for its citizens a sufficient way of life, an acceptable way of life, at least when compared to capitalism, and people in these countries found out about this. How this is relevant to the orthodox and revisionist debate, I can't necessarily say, but I can say this. If Ho Chi Minh and his comrades won the battle for Vietnam, they lost the battle to establish communism there. And that, at least for me, is one of the primary reasons to re-examine the Vietnam War. Thank you very much.
We're going to go right to the next speaker, Dr. Mark Moyar. Dr. Moyar is the youngest historian here. And even though, by our standards, he's a punk kid, he's been doing a great job on this history and inspired a lot of other people, including Dr. Kort. And his main book only takes Vietnam up to 1965. There's a copy of it to be seen out on the table there. He's finishing up the next chapter, or the next major volume on this. Going to be finished within the next year. And we're all looking forward to that. And it's gotten him tremendous attention. I think that he's probably been slammed by more historians than any other historian we know. It was interesting, they had to have a meeting in which people talked about his book. There's a whole book about the meeting, which is interesting, in which a number of other historians comment about his book. Some of them very favorably, some of them unfavorably, and it's interesting to look at the unfavorable ones. I've read it, and The favorable ones are all very well written, the unfavorable ones, they pick on stupid minor stuff, and he rebuts them very nicely. So he's a real historian who's done really well, and we're looking forward to more work from him. And I'm going to shut up and let him talk himself.
Thank you, Del, for that introduction. I also want to thank the VVFH, Vietnam Veterans for Factual History, for helping organize this, and the AVVBA, as well as Cinevis and Chick-fil-A. So thank you all for bringing this group together. And some of the things I was going to say have been well covered by other speakers, so I'll skip past some of those. I'm going to start off just talking about a couple of general issues. So people sometimes ask me, so how did you get interested in Vietnam? So for me, it started off with a high school teacher named Peter Scott, who was my English teacher, and he was very extremely thoughtful, articulate, virtuous. They're the model of someone you look up to. And in my generation, most of what we knew about Vietnam was from Apocalypse Now or The Deer Hunter, and or we saw sort of TV stories with, you know, the disheveled veteran who's homeless and just eventually commits suicide. And so this to me just really struck me as there's an incongruity there. I then took a course in college on the Vietnam War, and it was incredibly one-sided, which to me also raised a lot of questions. You know, university is supposed to be a place where you hear competing opinions, and so then I started doing my own research on it and realized that a lot of this one-sided research coming out was deeply flawed. And I would also point out to you, a lot of you probably now have grandkids who are in high school or college. I actually have 2 high schoolers and a college student. Chances are very good they're not going to get the right, they may not get any information about Vietnam, and if they do, it's probably going to be pretty flawed. And so don't rely on those folks. Don't rely on our educational system, because unfortunately it is not going to give them what they need. So try to find, and the books out on the table are great resources you can offer to folks. So also just a bit more about, so Triumph Forsaken, the book that was mentioned, I originally planned to write a history of the whole war from 54 to 75, and over a 5-year period. But as I got into it, you know, historians, if you're going to do something that big, you typically do more of what we call a synthesis, where you will rely heavily on books other people have written on more narrow topics, because you can't necessarily look at all the data for everything. So, but as I started getting into it, and then I realized so much of the other literature out there was flawed or was missing information, that I decided to basically do all the primary research myself. But that meant far more work than I had anticipated. So the first volume, Triumph Forsaken, which only goes up to 65, took 7 years to write. This next one, which goes through 68, now I've gotten pulled in lots of directions, but it's been on and off for about 13 years. So, but I think that's what you have to do if you want to really get to the heart of the matter. So there's so many people with axes to grind, and there's also just a lot of information that hasn't been found. You don't, I think, need to an explanation about the partisanship that goes on in the study of the Vietnam War. You know, a lot of it does concern big political issues, foreign policy questions, and you've heard about those already. I'm going to go into more depth on military side of things, and you've heard some about that, but I'm going to go a bit more detail on some of these things, which is less obvious, perhaps, what the bias might be there, but you know, there is a general tendency on the orthodox side of things to portray the conduct of the ground wars as essentially foolish, reflecting that this was just the biggest disaster, and I certainly do not buy that. I do tend to be closer to the position that was mentioned of Dale Andrade, where it's not an either or between was this conventional war, was this counterinsurgency. It was both, and it changed over time. So one of the big problems that I think you encounter with study the Vietnam War and your average person who knows something about it is a tendency to think it was basically the same kind of war for 15 years, from 1960 through 75. And in fact, it starts off as a guerrilla war, and that's what a lot of people think, but it becomes increasingly conventional over time and becomes, by the end, almost entirely conventional. I'll mention too, so one of the most important developments in studying the history of the Vietnam War has been the translation of histories from the other side. And you've seen a couple of them mentioned already, but Merle Pribenow, former CIA translator, has been instrumental for me and a lot of other historians in providing sources from the other side, which in many cases are quite candid. Now, officially during the war, the North Vietnamese, every battle was a glorious victory for them, but in these subsequent accounts, we see actually a fair amount of candor, not always, but sometimes, and you really actually see that they had enormous problems on many fronts. A lot of what they were trying to do did not succeed. And so we now know that, when Westmoreland was talking about a success, he wasn't some crazy fool who didn't know anything. In fact, there was a real basis for what he was saying. I'm going to run through a little bit, to understand the controversy over how the war was fought. I think it's worth going back a little bit to the start of the war, the end of the previous war in 1954, and the development during that relative period of peace from 54 to 59, because during this time, this is when South Vietnam starts developing its security forces. And at the time, people are thinking more about the Korean War model. The South Vietnamese, with our assistance, formed 7 conventional divisions, and they will then counterattack for failing to anticipate this guerrilla war, because guerrilla war, you would prefer to have lightly armed militia units that can secure the population. I disagree with that, and the argument that was made initially, which I think holds true throughout, is that your country cannot lose a war to guerrillas. It's going to lose to conventional forces, and Mao himself talks about this very clearly. Guerrillas who have AK-47s are not going to conquer a city of 1 million people that is defended by machine guns and artillery. And so you have to be prepared for that eventuality. If you just build a light militia force, your enemy will capitalize on that. It's also, I think, a fallacy that your conventional forces cannot fight in small unit patrolling. And probably a lot of you actually did a lot of small unit patrolling and know that big battalions can also break down into small units and do militia-type operations. President Diem at the time, he understood the dual nature of this threat, and he also asks the U.S. to support militias. And at the time, the U.S. Ambassador Dubois, who is not very sympathetic, he says, actually, the Viet Cong aren't a big threat to you, so we don't really need to fund these militia units. I also think that the bigger problem, we get caught up a lot of times in organizations fundamentally, and I've done other work on this, and it goes across all conflicts. The biggest question or biggest challenge you have in fighting this type of conflict is getting the human capital and getting the leadership, because South Vietnamese units, without exception throughout the war, fundamentally their quality was a reflection of the quality of their leadership. And when President Diem takes charge in 1954, he inherits a pretty small pool of good human capital. The French didn't build a large and capable officer corps. It was somewhat large, not necessarily capable. And so Diem actually goes through a process of building a new generation, but that's a period, that's going to take him about 7 years before it starts to bear fruit. But even so, in the late 50s, communists have not yet resorted to armed insurrection for the most part. They are relying on political subversion. They think Diem is weak. Turns out Diem is stronger than they bargained for. And so that leads to the decision in 1960 to start an armed insurgency, which is based on the model that Mao Zedong used in the Chinese Civil War. And as you heard was alluded to, there was a lot of misperception in the West that this was sort of spontaneously grown from the ground, but we now know, again, partly from the North Vietnamese accounts, that it was led by several thousand communists who infiltrated from the north back into the south, and they provided that leadership, which on their side as well was critical. And I will say too, I think their successes were more about leadership and organization than about ideology. And for many of them, they didn't really understand Marxist-Leninist ideology necessarily. Certainly, when they went to the South, they didn't preach that to the peasants. They preached to them something that was very contrary to socialism, which is that we're fighting for you to own your land. We're here for that purpose. And then, of course, after the war, they take the land. But at the time, that's what they're saying. And initially, the militias in 1960 are very weak. They're underfunded. So South Vietnamese army has to come in to the war to start doing some of the counter-guerrilla operations. 60-61, the war is going pretty well for the Viet Cong. 62, there's a stunning turnaround, and I've documented some like it's something that gets overlooked, especially because people have a lot of reasons to dislike President Ngo Diem and the American war effort. But communists themselves admit that there was this massive turnaround. A lot of it has to do with this new generation of leaders coming in. Strategic Hamlet program is actually quite successful in cutting off people's access to the population. Now, if you look, and if you've seen the Ken Burns series, this is the only thing really they show from this period is the one battle that the Viet Cong did pretty well, which was the Battle of Ao Bach, which was featured heavily in Neil Sheehan's book, A Bright Shining Lie. And in that book, Sheehan relies basically on John Paul Van's account that it was the South Vietnamese who, screwed this up, and despite his best advice. Now, I went back, and the Triumph Forsaken has a whole chapter on this battle. A lot of the big mistakes that were made there were actually committed by John Paul Van himself, and he lied to the press to try to push the blame off onto the South Vietnamese. And it said Viet Cong do pretty well. There's various mishaps. In any war, you're not going to win every battle. And if you look for most of 62, 63, it's actually going pretty well for the South Vietnamese. As things are going well militarily, we suddenly have the Buddhist crisis in the middle of 1963, which I think was certainly abetted by the communists. There was a big dispute within the U.S. government, should we support this or not? I won't go into all the details here, but there is the General Hopkins, the senior U.S. military commander, keeps making the point that the war is going pretty well. There's some in the press are questioning that, but really at the time it's portrayed as we need to overthrow the government because it's becoming unpopular over this Buddhist issue. Now later on, much later, after the coup, it becomes this huge disaster. People will try to claim, oh, well, the war wasn't going well, but in fact, I don't think that is really the case. So the coup happens November of 63. Contrary to the predictions of this great new era, the coup leaders end up purging many of the best people from the government in South Vietnam. They disarm strategic Hamlet militias, and the war goes south very quickly. We then have, moving into 1964, you have Lyndon Johnson talking about how he's the peace candidate and he's not going to send Americans to South Vietnam. We have the Tonkin Gulf incident where there is two attacks, well, certainly one attack, maybe two, but and this goes to back to some of the academic theories that Dr. Kort was mentioning in his excellent talk, there was this idea, we just need to do one little strike and we will send the message to the North Vietnamese and they will say, aha, the Americans mean business because they did this one little strike. But it turns out, we know now, the North Vietnamese saw that as weakness. If you were going to hit us, why didn't you use all your power? So the combination of that, Johnson's statements, and this decline in the South Vietnamese government will then lead in the end of 1964, just after Johnson's reelected, to a decision in Hanoi to undertake a conventional invasion with first entire North Vietnamese Army division, and they're counting on the Americans basically sitting on their hands based on what they're seeing. Now, of course, we know after the election, Johnson decides he does need to fight for Vietnam. I do think for the right reasons. He believed in the domino theory and couldn't let it go. But that period in early 1965, there are a large number of conventional battles that kind of get overlooked. And this again gets the question of, was it a conventional war? By early 1965, it's very much a conventional war. And you've got 2,000 North Vietnamese attacking one location. You're not going to defeat that with light infantry units. So you need the South Vietnamese Conventional Army. They start taking heavy losses, which is then what compels the United States to intervene. June of 65, Westmoreland says basically they're going to lose this war to the conventional forces of the enemy if we don't intervene. The U.S. does come in. Initially, we were basically backstopping the South Vietnamese, but August of 65, Westmoreland decides that U.S. units need to get in a bigger way. First real big battles, Operation Starlight, which I know we have at least one veteran of Operation Starlight here. Is any Operation Starlight veterans want to stand? I know we got Phil, yeah, so thank you. So a lot of people think the Ia Drang Valley battle was the first big one because they had the movie and the book and all that, but Starlight, and there were several others early on where, people really weren't quite sure how things were going to work out. And I think the Americans were pretty confident, but a lot of people had seen the North Vietnamese just winning one battle after another, and they thought, well, maybe the Americans are going to take a big hit here, but in fact, the Americans do inflict heavy losses, and this will be a recurring theme of the war. So late 65, you have a big debate over what should the United States strategy be. Westmoreland says we're going to fight a war of attrition, essentially. And this again gets back to the point that was made earlier that there are not other good options out there. You can't go outside the country. I do tend to think it was the best of rather limited options. But basically, his thinking was, we will, through this strategy of attrition, we will wear down the communists and buy time for South Vietnam to get back on its feet. And to do that, we're going to use search and destroy operations, which we're going to send out our big units out to look for the enemy wherever we can find them. North Vietnamese also pursue a strategy of attrition, but their objective is basically to erode America's will so that eventually the United States will get tired of casualties just like the French got tired and will want to go. Now initially there's actually a fair amount of criticism from the U.S. Marine Corps of Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy. The Marines are up in I Corps, and at the time I Corps is actually not the hotbed it will become. They want to focus on the coastal areas. They don't see a need to go out to go after the big enemy units. And there's this idea that the Combined Action Program, which would put a Marine squad with a popular force platoon, can actually win the war because you're just focusing on the population. What often gets lost is that by early '66, the Marines change, and as all of a sudden big NVA units come into I Corps, they start to recognize that they can't just sit in their coastal enclaves, and so General Walt, the senior Marine commander, in fact, starts sending out his battalions to go get the North Vietnamese before they can get to the population. Because once they're into the population, then your ability to use firepower is going to be much reduced, and they're also going to be able to fight you on where and when they want to. Westmoreland also made the argument, which I think was largely valid, that the pacification was best left largely to South Vietnamese forces because they had the linguistic skills, they had ties to the villages, and so there was, I think, a logic to say, we're going to let the Americans do most of the fighting out in the more remote areas, and the South Vietnamese do pacification. There's also a lot of mythology about the effectiveness of search and destroy operations. So the book I'm completing now, I've gone through a huge number of these battles to see exactly what happened. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, the Americans inflict far greater losses on the North Vietnamese. A lot of this has to do with the fact that America has this great air and artillery capability they can bring down. But we even see in a lot of cases where air and artillery wasn't used, the Americans are usually quite effective, and they take measures to ensure that they're not vulnerable to the North Vietnamese. Now, in the Ken Burns documentary, which I'm guessing a lot of you have seen, there is the period on 66 and 67, which I happened to be working on when this was coming out, and I wrote some things about it. But he basically looks at all hundreds of battles. Let me find the 6 ones where the Americans take the most losses, and we're going to throw those out and make it look like that is the representative sample, which I thought was very dishonest. But even in these battles, the Americans, do better than the North Vietnamese, but people make mistakes. So sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes things go awry, but it's I think worth noting how just one-sided that is. Something else too I would mention is there's been a lot of Westmoreland and others took a lot of heat for the so-called body count, where progress was measured based on the number of enemy casualties. And a lot of critics would say, well, this is a people's war, and it's not a big deal how many of the enemy you kill. And I'd say that's more true in a guerrilla war, although it's even not totally true then. But certainly not true when you get to a conventional war. If you have 50,000 troops, you're going to do a lot more in conventional war than if you've been knocked down to 25,000 troops through attrition. Move on to, we've already heard a lot of the discussion between the civilian and military leadership on strategy. The Joint Chiefs and Westmoreland from the very beginning are pushing for other options that they see as a way to achieve success much more quickly. Invasion of the North is one option that's floated. Going into Laos and Cambodia are also frequently mentioned. And as you heard, there was a fear of Chinese intervention, which was largely unfounded. There was also at the time, for a long time, there was disputes over how much help was really coming through Laos and Cambodia. And for a long time, CIA was maintaining there wasn't much coming through Cambodia. And finally, that was resolved in 1970, in the invasion of Cambodia, and suddenly realized massive supplies that were actually coming in through Sihanoukville. There is, on the question of Rolling Thunder, that's also from the beginning, Joint Chiefs and others pushing to reduce the restrictions. Also, one thing I found very interesting is President Eisenhower was very forthcoming, former President Eisenhower, in a lot of records of him saying you need to unshackle the bombing campaign, you need to do other things. And this is the former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe talking to President Johnson and Secretary McNamara, who don't really have a military background, and it is a bit surprising how little heed they pay to him. But even despite all these problems, search and destroy inflicts very heavy losses on the enemy. One of the myths about the war is that Hanoi was sort of infinitely patient and they were going to wait us out. Well, pretty clear now from their side. By the middle of 67, they become very impatient, and they see that they are taking these heavy losses and not getting much in return. So this is what leads them to the idea for the Tet Offensive. They are going to go into the cities. People are going to rise up in support of them, and that's going to force the United States to leave. Of course, that's not how Tet works out. The people don't rise up. The South Vietnamese rally. North Vietnamese take very heavy losses. One thing that's not as well known is that there's two subsequent offensives in May and August, which are called, sometimes referred to as mini Tet, but in fact they were also very large in scale, and they were actually, a lot of the Vietnamese communist commanders advised against it, but Le Duan was still convinced that this would work. So those also end in stunning defeat. So by October of 68, North Vietnam is really in very bad shape militarily. So this will then set the stage for improvements in pacification. In November of 68, the accelerated pacification program starts, and they find it already at the beginning the enemy is much weakened. At the same time, the South Vietnamese government is making a lot of headway. President Thieu is pretty vigorous in trying to fix some of the internal problems, the leadership problems. And by the way, I think he's also another person who gets a raw deal from history. There was a quote from one American diplomat that when Thieu came to power that he was the bottom of the barrel along with someone else, and that's kind of what gets thrown in. But in fact, the record at the time says almost all the Americans thought Thieu was highly effective. He was really the right person for the job. As this is happening, General Creighton Abrams comes in to replace General Westmoreland, and some of my friends, especially my friend Bob Surley, view this as a crucial turning point. I tend to think it's not as big a deal because Abrams comes into a situation that's very different in that communists have just lost these massive numbers of casualties, and they themselves decide to shift strategy. But Abrams certainly does a good job on that. Del, how are we doing on time here? Okay, all right. Well, I will cover. Yeah, a lot of this has been covered, so I'll just a couple of points I wanted to make on the question of the Easter Offensive you heard about. So it's true they got a lot of help from American air power, but our own forces could not have succeeded without American air power. So given the nature, and you've heard about this massive exposed flank that South Vietnam had, you can't defend that without the mobility that air power would give you, or allow you to strike the enemy at will when you need to. Let me just get forward. I wanted to make a plug for VVFH publications. There's a new one that I was fortunate enough to contribute to, and talking about the question of polarization of our society coming out of Vietnam. I do think that much of the polarization that we continue to see in this country goes back to Vietnam. And if you look at up until 1967, the war was pretty popular on college campuses. And then when the draft deferments ended at that point, you see this sudden rise in opposition to the war. And people like Michael Medved and Jim Webb and others have made that point, I think correctly, that it wasn't that people were against the war and that's why they were against the draft. They were against the draft. They were against the war because they didn't want to get drafted. And so, and I think ever since then you've seen, not everybody in that category, but certainly within academia, a lot of people who didn't go to Vietnam then had a reason to say it was a bad war, because if it was a bad war, then it was okay that I didn't go. So anyway, I covered that subject in there. There's more to read. I just wrap up reiterating something Del mentioned early on, is that Vietnam remains a critical part of our history, and I think how we think about Vietnam says a lot about how we think of ourselves as a people. And I think it supports, if you understand the Vietnam War, how it was not this huge blunder. It wasn't contrary to our national interest. I think it was in our interests. Unfortunately, we didn't fight it the way we wanted to, but I think it supports the idea that, in fact, there's something special about the United States. It's something that Americans should feel proud of, and something that should make our younger generations believe that it's a country worth fighting for. And so that's why I think it's so important that we're having this discussion today. So I will stop there, and we'll look for your questions after lunch.
Well, now we know who the brave people are who came back. Congratulations. I want to start off with a comment and invite a special guest. One thing that I think not everybody understands, I know not everybody understands, but I'll mention it. I have met and know a lot of veterans, from people who were there from 63 to people who were there in 75. And a lot of people there in the early years came out with a fairly negative impression of the ARVN. And there was a point in time in which a lot of the South Vietnamese military were not heavily competent. And there was selling of commissions, and there was corruption, et cetera. They always had some good units. The ARVN Marines, the ARVN Special Forces, the ARVN Rangers, et cetera, the 1st Division, they were always really good units. And at one point, you might have said early in the war that there was probably, 30% really good units, and maybe 40% mediocre units, and maybe 30% not so good units. Well, Vietnamization really worked. Well, of course, the biggest thing was Tet. Most people understand that Tet changed a lot of stuff in South Vietnam. A lot of people there had been kind of a little bit on the fence, like maybe it won't be so bad if we're under Ho or whatever. And what happened during Tet, especially the massacres in Hue, took everybody off the fence. The ARVN did not have to draft anybody for the next 8 months because there were so many volunteers who joined. And everything started changing, the training started changing, things got better. By the early 70s, Vietnamization was really working. The units had gotten much better. Here's a little known fact. The government distributed several 100,000 weapons to the local villages, to the LF, to the PF, the Popular Forces and village forces. And it's like, wait a second, the government's giving weapons to the people in the villages. What does that tell you about how things are working? And in fact, in the battles of 72, some of the PF and the forces actually beat the hell out of some of the NVA forces. Okay, so things changed a lot. They got a lot more competent. I do charity work in Vietnam, and one of the tragedies is that of the disabled veterans I see, a lot of them are old Vietnamese Marines who were already badly crippled before the war ended, because there are hardly any Vietnam Marines left alive who were fighting at the time of the end of the war, because most of them fought to the death up in I Corps. They just fought in the mountains until they were all dead. For those people who didn't fully appreciate the fact that the South Vietnamese did have really good soldiers, they were good allies, and they fought hard and died for their country, they did. Yeah. Whatever negative impressions we had from earlier parts of the war, some of the confusion, is something to be put aside and remember the way things really worked out. On that note, we have some Vietnamese guests here who would like to say a few words, so I'm inviting them up.
Del, as they come up, let me just add to that. I'm so glad you said that. If you look at the American Revolutionary Army in the first couple of years, it weren't very impressive. If you look at the South Korean Army in the first couple of years, some of you probably dealt with South Koreans in Vietnam, and they were incredibly good soldiers. The South Vietnamese military, the big issue was leadership. Bad political leadership. They didn't perform as well. That's also true of U.S. troops. You get good leaders, you get good troops. But I have the greatest respect for the ARVN and the various other elements of the South Vietnamese armed forces, and we betrayed them. And I think we owe them our thanks and our appreciation, so thanks for making that point.
I'm so emotional. Stand up here. I don't know what to say. My name is Hai Cao. I'm a Vietnamese American. So first of all, I would like to thank you, the organizers, and the presenter, the speaker, Professor Turner, Author Michael Kort, and Author Moyar, and especially Al, the moderator, will allow us some moment to say what I'm about to say. Ironically, today, we have a group of Vietnamese people attended here, but they represent the three generations. I am Hai Cao. I was about the late teen during the war at 1975 when the war ended. But sitting in here, there were people who were adult working involved in the war, like Mrs. Dung Cross, that's very well known to you guys here. She's the author of Mrs. Dung Cross. And then in the same generation with Mrs. Dung Cross was a former professor in Vietnam, Mr. Ki Vu. Mr. Ki, please stand up. And of course, like I said, I was just a student at the time. But there was particularly one person in our group today. She was not even born during the Vietnam War. She was were born after the end of Saigon, Vietnam War. She was born in kind of 6-7 months after that. And she's here today, represent only us, the three different generations, but also represent the Vietnamese American community of Georgia and the USA. So we just want to be here and oh, by the way, I haven't introduced her, Trà My. Her name is Trà My Nguyễn. Please stand up. I have the privilege to represent the three generations of Vietnam and to tell all of you, the Vietnam War vet of America, that we, unlike all of the things you heard or you say, or people say and you saw during the Vietnam War movie of Ken Burns, we really deeply, all of us appreciate for your sacrifice, your family sacrifice to participate in the war, to help us, and that's why we are here today to express again our deep, sincere appreciation for all the things you did for Vietnam and for the people of Vietnam. Thank you very much.
Well, we asked for questions, and damn it, we got questions. I tried to sort through them, and wow, we're going to do the best we can to get through some of these. I said there were other historian experts here, and we're going to defer to one of them right now. What about the Soviet financing through cutouts of peace movements, the American Friends Committee, resistance movements, others assisting internationally? What about, what happened with that? Was there in fact support from overseas for the anti-war people? And Dr. Roger Canfield is uniquely qualified to answer that question.
That was my question.
Yes, come on up here and open your big mouth.
Through a great deal of money laundering, The short answer is yes. We had Agent Solo, who was an FBI double, who carried all the money for the Communist Party. We had the Orthodox Church in Russia, which had money that was passed out. We had the Soviet support of the Conference on Vietnam and a whole bunch of other conferences. There was a Russian, a couple of Russian people, about 3 different ones, and I'm bad on Russian, and I got 7,000 footnotes, I don't remember the details, but one of them said that they spent more money on the political side than they did on the military. I think that's a little exaggerated, but it was a big number.
And let me say this, I've known a lot of people back then and since then who were anti-war people. Many of them were, in fact, very sincere people. I have met Quakers that I swear to God, you could kill their children in front of them and they would just pray for you. Not me, but okay. However, what's important is it didn't matter how many of the troops, in a sense, were so sincere. Much of the leadership of the anti-war movement were not anti-war. They were pro-Hanoi. They were pro-communist. Tom, what's his name? I remember, yeah, went to Paris and took his orders from a woman colonel, I think I've forgotten her name, and came back and said, I got my orders from the people over there who represent the NLF, okay? So the people at the top were, in fact, I hate to use the word treasonous, but I can't think of a better one. Yeah, close enough. But on the other hand, you still have to respect the fact that there were and are, sincere anti-war people, but they were what Lenin used to love to call useful idiots. And it's hard to believe, but we still have some of those today.
Hey, Del, can I make a comment? So, well, first thing, the anti-war movement, I would say, for one thing, it actually may have strengthened support for the war because it alienated so many people. But on the Soviet side, I think what's even more interesting is 1968, they are actually trying to influence our presidential election, which sometimes we think, oh no, that's something new that a foreign power would try to influence our election. So Anatoly Dobrynin, in his memoir, said they had offered Humphrey to finance his campaign because they viewed Humphrey as better than Nixon, and Humphrey apparently said, no thanks, I don't need your money. But that shows you the extent to which they want to do it. There's also a lot of suspicion. I don't know that it's ever been fully confirmed, but when there's this move towards peace before the election, a lot of people think the Soviets, we know the Soviets are encouraging this, to have a bombing halt right before the 68 election because it'll help Humphrey. And again, it gets short-circuited because President Chu sees through it. It's not because of Anna Chenot, as I think is often remembered, but President Chu saw that there was this last-minute effort to throw the 68 election to Humphrey by starting a bombing pause four days before the election. But Chu, again, is able to push back, and Nixon ends up winning. But again, I think that's one of the most fascinating Soviet stories to me.
I just add the story of Jane Fonda, who keeps getting arrested every day. But Jane Fonda went to Hanoi. She made broadcasts over Radio Hanoi directed at American sailors in the Tonkin Gulf, telling them that they should refuse to follow orders because the bombs they're being ordered to load are really loaded with poison gas, and that under the Nuremberg principles, if you load the bombs, you may be tried after the war and executed. If that's not treason, the word has no meaning. One other example, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War that John Kerry made famous, the executive director of that, and somebody has to remind me of his name, he was a Black Panther, Al Hubbard. Al Hubbard portrayed himself as an Air Force captain, medically retired pilot who had a bad scar on his back from having been wounded while landing at Da Nang. Actually, he was an enlisted E5. He had a scar on his back from a soccer injury, and FBI records revealed that when he went to Hanoi and to Paris, the Communist Party of the United States picked up the tab. I don't know any more about it than that, but they don't usually do that just as a charity effort. So when he was exposed as a total fraud, as far as I can tell, he vanished. But he was sitting next to Kerry on either Face the Nation or Meet the Press in April of '71, and there were a lot of the anti-war people were as patriotic as anyone in this room. They had been told that our government was propping up a dictator and blocking free elections, and there was no reason to be there. And they didn't want their government to be doing bad things. And I think our government failed by not responding to them. There were a small number of us going around responding to them, but for the most part, the State Department used a request for State Department spokesmen on campuses as a way of punishing people who had screwed up. They would take somebody who was disfavored and make them go out to Iowa or Kansas or somewhere. They were not experts on Vietnam, and they did a horrible job. And it was really tragic because the people of Vietnam paid the price, and the sacrifices of our brothers and a small number of sisters were, I won't say in vain, because I believe very good things came out of lasting 10 years. But we had the war won at the end. If Congress had not thrown in the towel, I don't have any doubt but that Hanoi would have had to back off, basically, because both Beijing and Moscow were pressuring them. They had bigger fish to fry with America, and they were talking about pulling back and waiting. And the correlation of forces in South Vietnam, the people in South Vietnam, about the time of the Tet Offensive, realized they didn't want to live under communism. They heard the stories about the mass graves in Hue. I was up in Hue in '71 when they were digging up mass graves. And that got the attention of a lot of Vietnamese. The Viet Cong used an awful lot of terror to get support, and the people didn't want that. So I think everything was really going our way until Congress threw in the towel.
As an additional comment to stuff that was said already this morning, I lived in Singapore in 1980. And the Singaporeans had no doubt, we had conversations, they had no doubt that we had saved them. They basically said they would have gone across Laos, Cambodia, they would have taken Thailand, they would have come down Malaysia, and we'd all be communists by now. But you blunted the drive of that whole thing, which is true. I mean, the North Vietnam lost 1.4 million men in the war. They lost more going to Cambodia. They lost more in that little war with China. And they were so exhausted, nobody was going anywhere after that. So the whole thing fizzled out. But the people who lived there, they really were quite sure that if we had not stopped them in Vietnam, if we had not exhausted them, they would have kept on going. Next question that came up, this was Mark for you, Dr. Turner. How might the balance of power with China be different today if South Vietnam had remained a sovereign Western allied nation, like South Korea?
It's a good question. I would start off by saying, had we, McNamara in his memoir said he wished he had favored abandoning Vietnam in '64, not responding to the Tonkin Resolution and so forth. Had that been the case, I think the world would have changed tremendously. China at that point was funding, supporting, training, arming revolutionary forces in South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and again, as far away as Mozambique. Had we given up in Vietnam, they would have taken Vietnam, and I think we would have found ourselves facing a dozen or more Vietnams. We could not possibly have won a dozen Vietnams. Financially, it's just too expensive, short of using nuclear weapons. So we would have basically faced the choice: do we use nukes and try to protect these countries, or do we allow the communists to take over the world one country at a time? I think it is just tremendously important. And an awful lot of third world countries did not want communism. They wanted power. Most of them were not Democrats, really. but they would support us if they thought we would protect them. But once they saw us abandon South Vietnam, all of their incentives were to cut the best deal they could with the communists, hopefully survive and maybe even share power for a few years. So I think the world would have gone to hell in a handbasket very quickly had we walked away from Vietnam. I think we could have easily lost the Cold War or had to fight a nuclear war over it. So obviously, had we prevailed, had South Vietnam become a free and independent democratic state, the Chinese wouldn't have liked that. They didn't like much what happened anyway. It turned out they also underestimated the Vietnamese and got their nose bloodied. But I think strategically, this was an incredibly important war. Those who said there was no reason to be there, I think are just fools. It's just, this was the test case. All of the senior communists said that. And once we gave up in Vietnam, who would listen to us? And then the question is, do we go it alone? Do we use nukes? I don't see a good outcome. I would go as far as to say when Jimmy Carter was defeated in the 1980 election, that also might have kept us from losing the Cold War, because we were losing all over the world under Carter. And Reagan came in and stood firm and turned things around, and before he left town, there was no Soviet empire, but it didn't have to happen that way.
And I'd add, until recently, I served in the Trump administration, and one of the biggest things that's happened I think one of the biggest changes we've seen in foreign policy, probably the biggest, is a shift in policy towards China. And I think belatedly, our country has realized the threat that China poses. In the national security world, we've seen a major shift away from the Middle East and terrorism towards competition with China. And what happened in Vietnam, I think, has a lot of relevance still today. If you think of if Indonesia or Malaysia had looked like North Korea today, what that competition would be like, or if we'd even be competing. And one of the things that, if you've been following the news, as we've been putting tariffs on China because of their unfair trade practices, we're shifting that production to other countries in Southeast Asia, and so they're a big asset for us. They're also themselves organizing, many of them, to resist China, which is a huge threat. I mean, China has become very sophisticated in using non-military power, and if you think of the fact that even our own basketball officials are afraid to criticize China, I think that shows you how, and if you're living in Asia that much closer, there's tremendous pressure, and so I think it's going to be a struggle that's with us for a long time, and one we have to be vigilant about.
Quickly pick up on something actually was said earlier, I think by Professor Kort, about how Vietnam has become more capitalist and so forth. The Pew Research Foundation does polls every year all over the world, and one of the recent polls, they asked people all over the world what they thought of the United States. So you might imagine we're hated in Russia, we're hated in Iran, and a lot of other countries. You know what country gave the United States the most powerful recommendation or applause, if you will, of any country in the world? Vietnam. So, whether you say we had it won and threw it away, or you say we lost the war, in the end, I think we've won. I think the Vietnamese people love the United States, and I could see them being an ally at some point, not too far off from now, which I think would be great. Just as I feel my dad fought in World War II, and now the Japanese and the Germans are close friends, and I think that's wonderful. So I would love to see Vietnam. Vietnam is a wonderful opportunity for a George Washington to lead that country to human freedom, and I would love to see that happen. I'd love to see it happen in my lifetime. Yes, exactly. Somebody who would lead them to a free, independent country where people have rights, and I think it would be a wonderful thing.
There's two questions up here that I actually am in a position to answer fairly well. They're about the industry and resources and riches of Vietnam and how important it was to us or to the French. The French were classic colonialists, imperialists. They were not enlightened. They were not as good occupiers as the British were in some ways, okay? They did bring some benefits to Vietnamese society. We owe the written Vietnamese language to a Catholic priest who made it up. We know the Ao Dai. We owe the Ao Dai to French fashion, actually, which is oddly enough. They did have, Michelin had a whole bunch of rubber plantations there. They had some mining interest there. And none of that meant a damn thing to us. We had no economic interest in Vietnam. Malaysia was the largest producer of natural rubber, happens to be my field of specialty, in the world, now the second largest. Thailand surpassed them. We could buy all the natural rubber we wanted from Malaysia for a lot less money than we were taking to get it out of Vietnam, and the French wanted it in any case. So we had no economic interest in going to Vietnam. That was never part of it. In fact, while we were there, again, one of the things that doesn't seem to get covered very well by, I don't know, Burns or anybody else, I forget how many hundred schools we built, dental clinics, medical calls, improvements, dug wells, paved roads. You know, we invested millions and millions of dollars and a lot of our people's energy in helping the Vietnamese Southern Society in lots and lots of ways that people still remember to this day there. Actually, what's funny, having traveled there and having friends travel to North Vietnam, we are much more popular in South Vietnam than we are in North Vietnam. That's partially because people in the South can resist the brainwashing to some extent. In North, brainwashing is even more complete. I have friends who go there and tourists, and I always tell people, it's a great country to go to as a tourist place, okay? Just be a tourist like you were a tourist in Germany in 1934, where you wouldn't ask to visit that little place up in Dachau, you know, and you wouldn't want to bother them with, can I see a synagogue? You'd leave it alone. If you go to Vietnam and you're a tourist, everything's fine. If you say one word about politics or anything like that, things become less friendly. Having personally been busted by the chief police of the entire province in Hue for the terribly illegal act, by his standards, of giving money to people he doesn't like, crippled old Army veterans, I can tell you that it's not quite a free society. You want to stay above that. But my friends sit there and said, well, you go there and you see all these kids going to school and they're all so pretty, they have these little red scarves on. Isn't that nice? And I said, yes, there's a reason. If you don't show up at school with a little red scarf, you don't go in. It's not complicated, it's simple, okay? And you will not advance in your grades if you can't recite the poems of Ho Chi Minh, if you can't sing the songs of the Communist Party. You get brainwashed until right through high school into college. I have met Vietnamese kids who moved here when they were 13, and they told me when they were 16 that it took them 2 years to start getting the crap out of their heads that got pushed into it, okay? So it's interesting, but we are more popular in the South than the North. People up North still are. Some of the Marines I know are married to Vietnamese, and the ones who are married to Vietnamese in the North don't enjoy going to visit the relatives. Okay, next question. In any case, that takes care of that one. Let's see. Here's a good one. Search and destroy was a failed strategy, somewhat. What do you think the outcome would be if we had launched an offensive against North Vietnam? Or in my case, I would say even if we threatened an invasion of North Vietnam. Mark?
And one thing to keep, I would say too, search and destroy were tactics that we used in pursuit of an attrition strategy, which was limited by the parameters on it. And there's a famous saying by Napoleon, if all you ever do is play defense, you're eventually going to lose. So I do think we could and should have gone into North Vietnam. So one of the points I make is, the French, didn't have an easy war there, but at the peak of the French war, they only had 100,000 troops in all of Vietnam. And if you actually went into the war, North Vietnamese could flee to the hills or China or someplace and fight you from there, but they lose their ports, they lose their railroads, they lose access to most of the population. And so if you went in and were able to control those things, it's a much easier war to fight. And you're not fighting, 500,000 conventionally armed troops.
And the next question is also addressed for you, Mark. An NVA cadre told me in 1970 the two biggest mistakes the U.S. made were killing Diem and not cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What do you think?
I agree on both those points. Yeah, the coup that overthrew Diem was an unmitigated disaster, and as I said, the war was actually going pretty well till that event took place. It was immediately followed by these massive purges, including some of the best people got pushed to the side, and it took years to recover from that. And as far as Laos, yeah, I agree. And Michael, I know, mentioned the comments we've seen from the North Vietnamese side that they were terrified of this option, and that would have really undone everything they were trying to do. And one of the things, too, I point out, there's several different sources from different sides that all, in about 64, 65, they all said 3 to 5 American divisions could block the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Later, when you get to Operation El Paso in 1968, planners say you could do it with 2 divisions, just the 1st Cavalry and the ARVN Airborne. So it was certainly feasible. Again, maybe not ended the war, but it certainly would have allowed us to fight under very different conditions that would be advantageous to us.
Let me just add something on Diem, because he was hated by many Americans who thought he was just an American puppet. If you read the Pentagon Papers, you find out he was nowhere near a puppet. He stood up to the Americans. He said, you're going to face a Korean-style invasion over the 17th parallel, so you need a big American-style army. And Diem said, no, I'm going to face a guerrilla war. I need a smaller, more elite counter-guerrilla force. We said, if you want money, you're going to do it our way. So he had to give in to us on that, but he was not an American puppet. But the most interesting experience, I talked about Diem, I had dinner with Tran Van Do, who was the State of Vietnam representative at the 54th Geneva Conference and Vietnam's foreign minister under Diem for a while. He and Diem had fought together, had fought against each other politically, but he had the greatest respect for him. And that's what I found from most of the South Vietnamese that I met who had known him. But I was driving back from My Tho to Saigon one evening with Bui Cong Tung sitting next to me in the front seat of my Chevy Suburban that belonged to the embassy. And just out of curiosity, I asked him, what did you think of Diem? Bui Cong Tung was, in my view, probably the most important political defector in the entire war. He was the head of education, culture, propaganda, and training for what they call Binh Tre province. We call it Quien Hoa province. That's where the revolution allegedly began. And he said, when we heard on the radio that Diem had been killed, we thought it must be some sort of a trick. For surely the Americans would not be foolish enough to allow anything to happen to Ngo Dinh Diem. He said, we senior Communist Party members viewed him in the same camp as we did Ho Chi Minh, as a great Vietnamese patriot. But because he would not accept the party's leadership, we had to use our propaganda apparatus to denounce him as a puppet and so forth. But in fact, he said he was very respected, not in the least corrupt, although his brother was, and a real patriot. He was not a Jeffersonian Democrat. He was a little bit weird in some ways. He did hire his relatives. John Kennedy hired his relatives. But he was a genuine patriot who was respected, and even the leading French scholars during their period there wrote about him for his competence, his integrity. So he was a good guy. And when we, part of our problem was the Brahmin Henry Cabot Lodge, U.S. ambassador from Boston, could not stand the idea that this local president somehow thought he was superior to the American proconsul who was used to giving orders for Asians to follow. And the fact that Diem stood up and said, I appreciate your advice, I appreciate your help, but I am the president of the Republic of Vietnam, and I will decide what we do and what we need. Lodge could not stand that, and they plotted to overthrow him. And it was, in my view, and Bill Colby shared this with me. I talked to him, and he said it was perhaps the most serious blunder of the entire war.
There's been a couple of questions about whether this presentation will be available or whether the slides will be available. There is going to be produced a video of this morning's presentations. That's up to AVVBA. So someone there can talk about it later perhaps, but it will become available at some point in time. And
We thought up till now that we would post it on YouTube or Vimeo or something, but if there's enough interest, we would make it available as a DVD.
yeah, it's even condensing it down with the breaks and everything, they're talking about 2.5 hours of talking, and you're not going to put 2.5 hours up on a YouTube thing. It'd have to be in sections. I'm hoping that we'll get a really nice DVD out of it that could be distributed to schools and maybe get used if we can get it to anywhere. We would send it to some colleges, but then they would promptly trash it, of course. But so that's that one. Okay.
You know, on a website somewhere, if somebody wants to do that, I certainly have no objection, and I'll give them a copy.
Yeah, Dr. Turner's slides are on the VVFH website. So if you go to www.vvfh, Victor, Foxtrot Hotel, I still remember, .org, you can find your way to that stuff. Question for Dr. Kort. When the B-52s went into the north in December, were they subject to kinds of restrictions that the other aircraft have been subject to? I think we know the answer to that, but...
Yeah. President Nixon removed most of the restrictions, and so, in the words of one of there are two generals named Palmer who wrote books on Vietnam. I'm just trying to remember which was which. One of them said, Linebacker 2 wasn't Rolling Thunder, it was war. And I think, you know, and and there's one other thing I might say, it's not part of the question. Linebacker 2 was accused, you know, suffered from accusations that it was indiscriminate bombing, that it killed many civilians, et cetera, et cetera. But if you go to one of the people I cited in my talk this morning, Mr. Turley, who's an orthodox historian, he will tell you that it wasn't that at all. That every effort was made to hit the military targets that were important, and that given the scale of the bombing and everything else, it took extraordinarily few civilian casualties. And I think it's important to be aware of that the effort to avoid civilian casualties continued, even when the restrictions that made things so difficult in having an effective bombing campaign were finally removed.
Let me comment on that. The actual number given by the authorities in Hanoi of civilians killed during the bombing between Hanoi and Haiphong was something like 1,500. And
There were anti-war people in Hanoi at the time from America who tried to talk them into claiming tens of thousands of fatalities. In fact, it was an incredibly low number of fatalities, 1,400 and some odd by their official count. And not all of those were the result of American bombing. Every time you fire a SAM missile into the air and miss, something called gravity plays a role, and it comes down to the ground and blows up, and people can be killed. But we really went out of our way, because every military operation has restrictions on it. There's something called the law of armed conflict. You cannot intentionally target civilian targets, for example. And we tried very hard to avoid that in both North and South Vietnam. Indeed, the Saigon representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross sent a letter to General Westmoreland in 1966 after Westmoreland had said we were going to give the full protections of the Third Geneva POW Convention to all Viet Cong members other than those captured while committing acts of terrorism. We were going to give them the full protection of the conventions, which they did not even arguably qualify for. And the Saigon rep of the ICRC said, never in the history of warfare has a country gone to greater effects, greater efforts to protect the rights of their enemies. So, you know, all this crap about we were routinely committing war crimes and bombing civilians and so forth, it's BS. Now, one reason the casualties were so low is Hanoi had a pretty good air defense system. They had little spider holes, you know, in the sidewalk basically, and when the siren went off, you crawl down in that and pull the cover over you, and if it's not a direct hit, you walk free, you know, an hour later. But we really tried very hard to comply with all the laws of armed conflict. And My Lai was worse than you read about, but it was really, you know, an exception. There were some war crimes. Anytime you take 2.7 million people and take them to a foreign country where grandma's not there to grab them by the ear if they misbehave, you're going to get some people who misbehave. You're going to get some rapists. You're going to get some people who just gratuitously murder people. And we court-martialed a number of people for such crimes. But it was never our policy to cover up war crimes or not to comply fully with the law of armed conflict.
Just for interesting statistics, we hit a town in Germany, Dresden, with a quarter of the tonnage we dropped on Hanoi and Haiphong and killed over 30,000 people. That was carpet bombing, okay? What went on in Hanoi and Haiphong was the direct opposite of taking enormous pains. What was interesting was they were trying to show some French journalists how terrible the bombing was, and they drove them down to show them a destroyed military installation. Across the street from it was a bunch of apartment buildings. They had their windows blown out, but they were untouched. And the French were like, wait a second, we've seen bombing damage in France from World War II. This doesn't look anything like that. The tour got cut short right after that. Another question, let's see. This is one for Dr. Kort again. Your book, Vietnam War Reexamined, has high intellectual honesty and balance. How has it been received in today's academic community?
There've been I haven't yet encountered the vitriol that Mark did, but that's because I don't think the book, you know, contains any of the revelations that Mark presented when he wrote his book. But one review quite uncivil, another that at least was civil, disagreeing, and largely for other places, what they do is largely just ignore it. So that's basically been the reception in academia.
There's a question that was for anybody, which I think I can probably answer. In your knowledge and opinion, do you believe the U.S. is doing well in the humanitarian mission of recovery of personnel in Vietnam? Why or why not? I'm involved in this because I know a number of POWs who've been involved in this, and we've talked about it at length. If the question is, did we get all of our POWs back at the end of the war? The answer is absolutely not. We did not get everybody back. There's no question. The question is, how many did we not get back? There are people who say there's 1,200, and I'm afraid that's nonsense. There's not 1,200 people that were alive and left behind. There were certainly some number between 40 and maybe 80 or 90 or 100 that we didn't get back. We know of, during the linebacker bombing, one of the B-52s came down and the entire crew was captured. And they showed up at one of the POW camps where one of the POWs I know saw them. He saw the entire crew, which is, I think, like 12 or 13 guys. And the next day they were gone. And they never heard from again. They were never listed as being captured. And what everybody believes is they were sent to Russia someplace so they would interrogate them about how B-52s worked. So we didn't get everybody back. Interestingly enough, we didn't get everybody back in Korea. Most people knew that. And the Korean POW Families Association, when the negotiations were going on, tried to tell our negotiators, whatever you do, don't just take these people at their word, bargain much more carefully and get lists of names and who's really there and all this good stuff. And they were ignored because everybody was in a hurry to get it over and done with. So they accepted what Hanoi told them, and they took the people that we got, and I'm glad we got them all back. But there's no question we didn't get everybody back. And at this point in time, we're never going to know the full truth, at least not that I can tell. We have been getting the bodies back more and more. They've cooperated with that. Of course, they cooperate with that because they basically sell them back to us. Because I knew guys who were on the teams going in to look at the stuff, and they do these things like, you have to hire a bunch of Vietnamese laborers to help you. You pay them $50 a day. The government pays them $5 a day. You have to rent Soviet helicopters to take your people someplace. You pay thousands of dollars for the Soviet helicopter to take your guys someplace that are part of the background costs of the government. Okay, so it's a money-raising scheme for them. But we have been getting more and more remains back. And a lot of stuff was lies. There were people that they said they hadn't captured. One of my classmates had disappeared. They said they hadn't captured him. Later on, they got his body back. He had been processed and embalmed by the North Vietnamese. They had him the whole time and just didn't admit that they ever had him until they gave his body back. So, no, we haven't got everybody back. We've tried fairly hard, not hard enough. I think it's kind of scandalous that both two of our senators, who I will not name right now, were part of, I said I wasn't going to name it, I'm glad you did, were part of legislation that said we were going to close the books on this stuff and not go anywhere with it. So the sad news is we didn't get all our guys back, and it pains me to think of whether it was 40 or 80 Americans who I believe by now are long dead, who suffered total despair and died in Russia or Cuba or somewhere else. But that's just the way it is, and it's a tragedy. Okay. Trying to find something that's current. Here's a question that I'm not sure who should answer. How corrupt was RVN government? Was that part of the problem of their not being able to survive? And secondarily, did we use the Vietnamese traditional fear of China effectively? Who wants to field one of those?
I can comment on both of those. So on the corruption issue, as Bob mentioned, Diem was widely viewed as being not corrupt. He also, part of his appeal was that this notion of being an ascetic father figure. He also didn't marry, and that supported that. Ho Chi Minh cultivated that, and we have since learned he actually had a couple wives that he tried to kind of keep secret. But there's a premium in Vietnamese society for having that appearance of somebody who is not rewarding themselves through public funds. Now there are different views in Vietnam, as in much of the world. What we view as corruption isn't necessarily quite the same. People also like to point out Lyndon Johnson was a pretty corrupt fellow himself, so we sometimes overlook the corruption in our own society. There were certainly others, and I think to some extent it's inevitable. Whenever the U.S. pours huge amounts of money into another country, there's going to be corruption. There was, one thing that's interesting to point out too, some of the Vietnamese who were corrupt were also very good fighters, but some of them were not. They did clean up their act, I think, towards the end as our presence declined. One thing too I want to mention that came up to some degree earlier, but in terms of the quality of the ARVN and their leadership, there was there were there's a series of coups in Vietnam, and thereafter, if you were the chief of state, you had to think about who was going to be loyal to you in a coup, and that would sometimes undermine efficiency. But I would point out too, and I'm guessing there's some Civil War buffs here, but if you look at our own Civil War, this is more on the northern side, so I'm not sure if this resonates as much in Georgia, but in the north, one of the things you always hear complaints about is the political generals. Lincoln was appointing these politicians who were not good generals to leadership positions, and he did that to get support from the states. So it's also something inherent in a civil war. The one other point I wanted to make about ARVN, since it came up. So by 1968, they had lowered the draft age in South Vietnam. If you look on a per capita basis, the South Vietnamese armed forces in 1968 are equal to U.S. armed forces of 18 million troops, which is 1.5 times what we put together in World War II. So they certainly went all the way forward in terms of mobilizing their country. And the China-Vietnam part, one of the points I make in Triumph Forsaken is that we have exaggerated the historical animosity between China and Vietnam. And if you look back in history, for 1,000 years prior to the Vietnam War, there's only 3 wars between China and Vietnam. And those were basically instigated by the Vietnamese. And for the most part, there's actually a lot of agreement and cooperation. When the French come in the late 19th century, they actually appeal to China for help because they are a vassal of China, and China comes in and fights the French and then loses. But if you look at Ho Chi Minh's early career, he's also very close to the Chinese. And I think the falling out between China and Vietnam has a lot to do with the Vietnam War, because as we intensified the war, the Vietnamese had to rely increasingly on the Soviets because they had the advanced anti-aircraft weaponry, among other things. And so you see a falling out starting in the late 60s. But I think we shouldn't assume that this is an inevitable fact. Right now, this is a big issue too, because I think there's a lot of people counting on us using Vietnam as a counterweight to China. I'm not sure we can count on that, especially, as mentioned, Vietnam is not a free society. They're not South Korea or Indonesia. And so we need to be careful, and I think it's certainly possible that they could turn depending on who's in charge. Ho Chi Minh throughout his life was pro-Chinese, but he dies in '69, and Lê Duan by this time has taken over, and he's much less amenable to China. So again, China right now is very aggressive in cultivating the elites of Southeast Asia. They're doing a lot of what we used to do more of, which is bring those people to China on scholarships to increase their sympathy for China. So we have to be, hopefully we can get Vietnam to be a bulwark against China, but I don't think we can assume it's inevitable.
I have a question from one of our Vietnamese guests. I'm going to throw this out to all 3 of you. Did the U.S. purposely abandon South Vietnam and let the Viet Cong take over the country? Why withdraw and give up at the last minute? Would the outcome have been different if the U.S. had stayed a lot longer? I have some opinions about that. So
I hate to sound like Bill Clinton and say it depends on the definition of U.S., but I think Nixon deserves praise for his efforts to save South Vietnam. There was a time when a lot of American officials felt like the effort was lost, and so we should cut our losses. There were a number of people who, for reasons of moral courage, said no to that, and Richard Nixon was one of them. Another one was Graham, U.S. Ambassador in Saigon, Graham Martin, who was a good friend of mine. I was actually in the embassy in the final days, and Graham came out of his office and saw I was out there and said, "Come in for a minute." And for about 45 minutes, he unloaded me on all the pressure he was under to abandon South Vietnam. Now, Graham had lost a son in Vietnam, and he cared about it, but he was also a very moral, he was a Southern gentleman. He was from South Carolina, I believe, and he was not going to abandon South Vietnam. He delayed the evacuation of Americans and took great criticism for it because he felt that when he did that, it would seal the fate of the South Vietnamese. He wanted to give them some chance to try to negotiate some sort of a deal. I have Vietnamese and American veteran friends who feel like Nixon totally betrayed Thieu. He didn't have any choice. Congress controls the purse strings. Congress, the election of 1972 brought to power a lot of people that might not have been able to spell Vietnam or find it on an outline map of the world, but they knew it was evil and we wanted to cut our ties with it and bring our boys home and so forth. And they ultimately had the votes. They cut the aid back dramatically. They prohibited the use of any U.S. troops. Now, my professional field for the last 32 years has been national security law. I've written multiple books about the War Powers Resolution. I wrote a 1,700-page doctoral treatise on national security and the Constitution. It goes back to the early debates on this. I don't think Congress had the power to do what they did. They had every right to deny new funds, but to pass a law saying you can't use funds we've already appropriated, that interferes with the command, which the Supreme Court has repeatedly said belongs exclusively to the commander-in-chief, to the president. But I think there were some great people at the end who with courage stood up and tried to prevent what happened from happening. But there were also a lot of people who said, hey, the orders have changed, salute, and screw the Vietnamese. I hate to use that language, but that's essentially what it was, and it was tragic. I was there at the end. I watched Americans make promises and then go to the airport and fly back to the States. My Vietnamese interpreter, when Van Quy was dying of cancer, and what used to be Third Field Hospital, you all remember, was then Seventh Day Adventist Hospital at Tan Son Nhut. And I went in to see him one day, and the doctors came, and they said, well, we'll see you in the morning. And they went to the airport and flew home. Everywhere I turned, some Americans were betraying Vietnamese who had relied upon us. USAID told their Vietnamese employees to assemble at a certain park in Saigon where rescue helicopters would be there to take them to ships. Instead, the Americans went to a different park and were evacuated. So I think the final days were, calling it Black Sunday or Black April or whatever you want, it was one of the few times in my life when I felt shame to be an American. And I think that story needs to be told, but I think a lot of people tried very hard to carry out our promises to the Vietnamese. And there were some people who served very bravely at the end, trying to get at everybody they could. I brought out the wife of a friend of mine who was the public affairs officer for the embassy, and a Vietnamese woman I'd worked with who had a master's degree from Michigan State, and I knew she'd do fine. And I said she was my fiance. And as soon as I got to a refugee camp, I pulled up my U.S. Senate ID card, and I said, I need to go back to Saigon. I was going to bring another fiance out. I figured if my government was betraying its word, I was going to betray mine too. And they told me, sir, they're evacuating the last people by helicopters as we speak. Nobody's going back. And I still feel guilty that I couldn't do more. I tried hard. I went back during the orphan lift because the governor of Michigan, I was working for a Michigan senator, and the governor of Michigan declared an open door policy and said, any orphans you can bring back from Indochina, we will find homes for. And I talked to Graham Martin and I said, look, we've got flights full of rice going into Phnom Penh every morning. Let me go in there and fill them up with orphans and bring them back. And I found a group of stewardesses, cabin attendants, they call them today, who knew how to change diapers and feed formula. And they said, we will go with you and take care of the babies and the kids to do that. And I still have a telegram the embassy sent to Phnom Penh saying Robert Turner, staff aide to Senator Griffin, wants to come to Phnom Penh to explore possibility of rescuing orphans. I also have a handwritten note from George Jacobson saying, Mr. Turner, not possible to travel to Phnom Penh at this time, we'll explain later. I immediately walked over to the embassy, and as I turned the corner, it was a Saigon Post, one of those little Mama San stands with all the newspapers. Banner headline, Phnom Penh Falls. 2 days later, Khmer Rouge began killing foes. And I still have trouble when I go to graduation and an Asian student walks across the stage, and I think about the hundreds of kids we might have gotten out of Cambodia that might be doing that in the United States today. It breaks my heart, but a lot of bad things happened at the end, and I wasn't smart enough soon enough. But anyway, a lot of people fought hard at the end to save South Vietnam. I think Jerry Ford was one of them. I think Nixon was one of them. I think Graham Martin was one of them. And these people will always be heroes to me, despite the faults they had. Nobody's perfect. But there were people who just said, hey, new marching orders, screw the Vietnamese, let's go home. And to their credit, there were a good number of people who wouldn't buy that, and I'm proud of them.
Well, Dell gave me the stage, so I'm going to preemptively make you guys a promise. We've only got a half hour left for questions, and there's no way we can get through them all. So I will promise you that I'll put all the rest of the questions up on our website. And the answers too, of course. Here's an interesting one for you guys. I don't know if you can answer this or not. What can any of the speakers tell us about Operation Popeye, seeding clouds to make it rain more to hamper NBA BC operations?
So I can talk about that. This was part of the debate over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The military has been repeatedly pushing to put U.S. ground forces into Laos. And every time they tried to do that, the U.S. ambassador to Laos, William Sullivan, started screaming bloody murder and coming up with every reason under the sun why we shouldn't do that. We had this neutralization agreement, which the North Vietnamese never respected. We pulled our troops out in '62. They were supposed to pull theirs. They didn't. This drove the military crazy, justifiably. Never fully comprehended why Sullivan actually did this. He claimed that, there was benefit to having the Laotian government on our side. I don't really think that's true because their armed forces were almost non-existent. I mean, the good fighters were working for the CIA at the time. So anyway, this came up during one of the iterations of the Joint Chiefs calling for heightened ground operations in Laos. Sullivan came back. There was Popeye, and the other one was, I think, Commando Lava. And together, these chemicals would, they'd induce rain, and then they'd turn the roads to mud. And he said, if we do this, we're going to gum up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We don't need to put force in because we have these chemicals. And I think at the end of his telegram, when he talks about this, he says, "Make mud, not war." Those programs they were used to some extent, but they never achieved, that purpose of stopping traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The North Vietnamese had built all-weather roads because they'd always had problems with the rainy season and mud. So it was a gimmick that did not achieve its strategic purpose.
Just as a reference, by the end of the war, I knew Hoi Tran was one of the pilots we knew, the South Vietnamese pilot, and they were bombing Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they would find convoys of 200 trucks at a time going down the trail. And there were photographs of a truck park in North Vietnam that had 5,000 trucks in it. People think that we spent way too much money in Vietnam. The Russians and the Chinese spent a great deal of money in Vietnam. And whether you measure it by dollars or not, if you measure it against their gross national products, they may have spent more money than we did. But they supplied thousands of trucks, 1,500 tanks at least, many hundred pieces of artillery, better than anything we let the South Vietnamese, oceans of fuel, millions of uniforms, millions of AK-47s, just incredible amounts of supplies, more than we ever left to the South. So they invested well, and as Bob Sorley once said, in a sense, the bad news was that the Russians were more consistent, faithful allies than we were. Question here, has any research shown that JFK wanted to avoid putting more troops in Vietnam and was opposed by his State Department, in particular his ambassador?
On the periphery of that, we have the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, which is a center that does a lot of oral histories on presidents and so forth. They have an interview with Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, shortly, and Kennedy's closest personal advisor, shortly before his death. And they asked him, it has been said that President Kennedy was planning on pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam after the election. Is that true? Response, no. I think if Kennedy had been secretly planning to abandon his commitment, his brother would have known about it. And so, you know, the lot of pro-Kennedy people who came up with this, what I see as fantasy, oh, Kennedy wasn't going to allow Vietnam to go on. If he had lived, he would have ended it all. And I don't see any reason to believe that's true. Kennedy was dedicated to Vietnam. Kennedy, as a senator in 1956, had given a major speech to the American Friends of Vietnam, talking about Vietnam basically being the keystone to the archway, or something, you know, the finger in the dike, if you will, and it was imperative for us to stand up against communism in Vietnam. And I just can't imagine that he would have abandoned that view. The killing, the assassination, if you will, of Ngo Dinh Diem was mostly engineered by some rather low-level people in the State Department, Roger Harriman and a few others. They went to Gene Acheson, the Secretary of State, and said the president has already approved this. And that's how they got Acheson to sign off. They went to the president and basically said, Acheson is recommending this, and he went along with it. And when the coup took place, and Kennedy was briefed, was told in the Oval Office, Diem has been killed, people said his face turned red and he had to leave the room. You know, I was never a big Kennedy fan, but I think he was a decent man who understood the threat of communism, who knew Diem. Both were, of course, Catholics. He had been introduced to Diem by, it was Cardinal Spellman, and he wanted to see South Vietnam saved. To his credit, Kennedy understood that we were going to face an unconventional warfare challenge, and he beefed up the special forces. My last Army assignment before I went to Vietnam was working directly for Lieutenant General Bill Yarborough, William P. Yarborough, who had commanded special forces under Kennedy. And we spent a lot of time talking about Vietnam and other things. He was the only flag officer I ever met who I thought really understood unconventional warfare. We remained lifelong friends till he died in 2005. But I think Kennedy basically was right on this. I think he had some people around him who resented the fact that this little guy thought he was the president of Vietnam instead of, you know, subordinate to the American Pro-Council. And I think I blame Henry Cabot Lodge for a lot of things that went wrong. The ambassador before Lodge, Fritz Nolting, was a colleague of mine when I taught in the UVA, was now the politics department, and we were good friends. And he was totally cut out of the loop because he was too pro-Diem. He had the greatest respect for Diem. And then they brought in Lodge, and the Young Turks in the State Department said, let's get rid of Diem. And that almost lost us the war.
Can I comment on that too? So I'd say two things. One, Kennedy, when he comes into office, there's less than 1,000 Americans there. He increases that number to 16,000, and he talks repeatedly of why Vietnam is so important. And he specifically says he screwed up the Bay of Pigs, he screwed up Laos, he needs a success somewhere. So he's definitely committed on those grounds. The other thing I'd say is, if you fast forward to 1965 and what Kennedy would have faced, there is enormous pressure from other countries in Asia for American intervention. This is something that often gets lost, but you have pretty much every country in Southeast Asia saying if you leave Vietnam, the whole region's going. You even hit the U.S. ambassador to Japan is saying Japan is going to go. So I can't imagine Kennedy just pulling out in 65.
There's a interesting rumor that the United States rejected a communist Vietnamese surrender during the 1972 Haiphong port blockade. Is that a myth? My best guess it is, but I'll let one of you answer. Second, pardon me? I've never heard of it. Yeah, I never heard of it either. But second question is, was Watergate the main cause the Democratic-controlled Congress passed a law to force the U.S. to stop aiding South Vietnam? Dr. Kort hasn't answered anything for a long time.
Okay, no. Congress hated Richard Nixon. He was not part of the in crowd. He almost always needed a shave. And he was determined to defend South Vietnam. Many in Congress wanted to see South Vietnam go down. I mean, it was sad. I spent 5 years working in the Senate, including the last 2 years of the war. And in the Reagan administration, I was the acting Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs. Spent a lot of time up on the Hill dealing with senators and so forth. They did not understand at all what Vietnam was about. They were visited left and right by anti-war groups. They would go home and give speeches, and some hippie would stand up and say, "Why are you killing babies?" And they just wanted to get rid of it. They didn't understand it. They had no love for Nixon. And, the reason they were, you may have heard in the last month that Nixon was impeached. It's not true. The House was prepared to impeach him when Nixon resigned. Ironically, my boss, Senator Griffin, played a decisive role in Nixon's decision. I was in the office on Saturday for my own reasons, and the woman, one of the typists, was exchanging faxes with the senator who was back in Michigan, and she came running into my office and said, "Look at this." And the text had said, "It's my opinion that the president will be impeached by the House." And he had put a little caret under just before that and said, "If he does not choose to resign, the House will impeach him." And Monday afternoon's Washington Star had a banner headline, "Griffin to Nixon, resign." Now, I didn't see anybody mention the fact that my boss, Bob Griffin, and Vice President Jerry Ford were best friends. They had been neighboring congressmen for years. And I've often wondered if Griffin was motivated by the fact that let's replace Nixon with my best friend. But at any rate, had there been no Vietnam War, I don't think Nixon would have been impeached. They were angry at him for not letting them control the war, for continuing the war when they thought we should abandon the Vietnamese. Again, I think Nixon was not perfect. He used some bad language, not nearly as much as LBJ did, but I think he was a man of honor who felt it was important not to allow the communists to win, and he fought very hard, and in the process he really offended members of Congress, and they wanted his scalp. And so I don't think what Watergate did, and by the way, I knew a guy who was a senior player in the Nixon White House who told me that they had information that Cuba was providing funds to the Democratic National Committee. And the reason they broke in to the Watergate headquarters was to try to find evidence of that. And they bungled it, and an alarm went off, or a cop found an unlocked door, and that led to the whole Watergate scandal. I never saw a bit of evidence that Nixon approved of it, authorized it, or anything else, but he did cover it up. He did try to protect his people. He thought that Eisenhower had been wrong when he One of Ike's aides accepted I think it was called a vicuna coat, some sort of a fur coat. Sherman was his name, I think. Sherman Adams. And Nixon felt that Ike should have protected him, and he tried to protect his staff of the plumbers, and that's what was going to lead to his impeachment. There's no question the votes were in the House to impeach him, but the House never voted because he resigned first. And Watergate was a convenient excuse to go after him, but the real underlying reason they were outraged over his efforts in Vietnam when they were trying to abandon Vietnam and his secret bombing. The presidents have conducted bombings for years without telling Congress. Not one person in Congress was told we're going in on D-Day, which is why we wanted D-Day. But anyway, no, I'm sorry, go ahead. There was a second part to that.
No, the first part was that legend, which we don't believe.
Oh, no, I've never heard of that, obviously.
Simple question. Are there any female authors of books on Vietnam? There's only one I know of, a nurse. Yeah, there's a Fire in the Lake by some person which we don't care for. And there was a nurse, Deventer. Oh. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say she was not a she was too young to be in the war, but yes, Leanne Hong, the book Hanoi's War is quite good. There's something else you can.
Yeah, there's several
Also,
inter-war books by one.
going back to the 60s, in terms of reporters there was a reporter from the New York Herald Tribune, Margaret Higgins. And yes, very, very good book. She died very young, and her book's been forgotten, and that's very unfortunate. It makes very good reading.
Yeah, and also Ellen Hammer, Death in November, yes, is also an excellent book on the coup.
Hammer did, I think, these two books.
Death in November.
Our Vietnam Nightmare.
Yeah, and she was great. I mean, she was really, I'm trying to find a nice way to say what I'm thinking, but she was more manly than a lot of the guys over there. She'd go anywhere. She was gutsy. She stood up. She was pursuing the truth and in the best tradition. And I think she was one of the best journalists we had in Vietnam in the entire war.
I bet if you did a search for, quote, female authors, unquote, Vietnam, names would start coming up. Here's a question that we were just talking about the other night. When military advice was ignored by Johnson, why didn't the military Joint Chiefs have the courage to resign in protest? We've had a long discussion about that because a lot of us thought they should have, and other people have written books saying they should have. And the answer is apparently that they thought about it and decided that they would do more good if they tried to stay in their jobs and maybe talk LBJ into being, more sensible, which didn't work out well at all. Personally, as I voiced my opinion last night, it takes a lot of nerve to sit there and say, I'm a general member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and I'm resigning now and ending my career. And I think they were partially just too chicken to do it. I wish they had. They might have done some good.
Yeah, I talked to Charlie Cooper. Charlie was, I think he retired as a 3-star, but at least a 2-star Marine. But I thought so. But as a major, he was an aide to Admiral McDonnell, the chief of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and they had been insisting on a meeting with the president. They went over. Charlie's job was to carry a map of Vietnam on a plywood board and put it on an easel that was supposed to be in the Oval Office. He got in the Oval Office. There was no easel. LBJ said, you can stand over there and hold the map. So he was a fly on the wall. And he claims that LBJ very cordially greeted all of the chiefs, said, what can I do for you? And the chairman said, Mr. President, we feel strongly we are totally mishandling the Vietnam War. We need to be more firm, so forth and so on. McNamara's, cutting everything back. And he said, LBJ then said, well, Wallace Green, the commandant of the Marine Corps, General, do you agree with this? And he went to the others. And then he turned his back on them for several seconds. and he turned around and exploded in profanity, saying they were trying to cause World War III and they could get out of his blanket office. And he was a famous bully, but he bullied these guys. And as they rode back in the car to the Pentagon, they discussed resigning. And they finally decided if we resign, he will appoint yes men, and our ability to change things it will be cowardice for us to abandon this position now and let him turn it over to yes men. And so they decided to stay. I don't know if it was the right decision or not. I've studied this. Charlie Cooper gave me a copy of a letter he had received from Chairman McDonnell, the Chief of Naval Operations, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And it said, I read your article, you got it exactly right, thanks for telling it. I sent a letter to Wallace Green, the Commandant of the Marine Corps. I got a very shaky letter back on my letter responding, and he said, forgive my bad handwriting, I've recently had a stroke, but I was there, and everything he says in this article is true. Wallace Green had a tremendous reputation as a man of integrity. I talked to H.R. McMaster when he was a major, and he said, I can't prove it, but I believe it happened. And one last thing, Drew Pearson or Jack Anderson had a column later that month saying the Joint Chiefs have tried to pressure the president into starting World War III. So to me, the White House certainly leaked the story. But nobody can document the meeting, but I think it happened.
Here's we talked about the other day. There's been a legend going around that Dean Rusk or someone was always telling the Swedes or the Swiss, depending on which legend you've heard, about the oncoming bombing plans, so that they could pass it on to Hanoi, so that they would avoid civilian casualties. And that comes under the heading of bullpucky, I think, or something along those lines. We had a long discussion about it, if anybody wants to comment, but the bottom line is none of us believe that. Good. Trying to get through some. We're running out of time here, so I'm just trying to get through a few more questions while we can. Let's see. This one I think has been answered. Was the Gulf of Tonkin incident really happened, or was it, what was the truth? There's no question that the Maddox was attacked. There's no question whatsoever. There were bullet holes, there were recordings, and for that matter, in the War Museum in Hanoi, there was, for a period of time, a torpedo tube displayed. I've seen pictures of it, with pictures of the naval officers above it who got medals for attacking the Maddox. So
Yeah, that's absolutely clear. And when McNamara went to Hanoi, I think it was in '99, General Vo-En Jop confirmed the first attack occurred. The second attack, there was strong evidence it occurred. My current view is it probably did not occur, but I have spoken to people who were on the Sea Turner Joy who have sworn to me it happened, and I don't question their sincerity at all. The question is, it was relatively primitive sonar. They could have been interpreting wake from the other American destroyer as being from a boat. There was a high phosphorus content that I've been in the North Sea, and you see trails like almost luminescent that might easily be seen to be torpedo trails. And so I don't know if the second one occurred. The one thing that is absolutely certain is it was reported to Washington as if it had occurred. And we also know that when the first attack was reported, LBJ's response was, let's not overreact. Maybe this was just a freelancing skipper. We don't want to, And when the second one occurred, he says, we have to act. And so they bombed. But the most important thing is, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution had very little to do with those minor exchanges in the Gulf of Tonkin. It had to do with an effort that Hanoi started May 19th, 1959, to overthrow its neighbor by force. If you read the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, it talks about this long campaign to overthrow South Vietnam. We went to war in South Vietnam for the same reason we went to war in Korea, to stop communist aggression. And whether or not neither or both attacks occurred, there is no evidence that they were staged. There is considerable proof that at one point, NSA realized that one of their interpreters had mistranslated an intercepted document, and a major and somebody below him decided to cover it up. They didn't want to get in trouble for it. That's not some government scheme to lie to the people or anything like that. So we didn't need that attack to justify going to the aid of South Vietnam. They were being attacked regularly. December 24th of that same year of '64, they blew up much of the Brinks, was it Brinks BOQ? A VC dressed as a South Vietnamese officer drove into the Brinks compound with a car bomb, said he was looking for Major something or other, who they happened to know had just rotated and got back to the States. They said, oh, we don't see, you didn't answer, whatever. Told him to park it. They deed him out. It blew up. It killed a bunch of people. They were front page photographs of bloodied Americans. If we needed an excuse, the blowing up of American planes at Pleiku, there were all sorts of incidents. If we needed that straw that broke the camel's back. But the Gulf of Tonkin was not a major part of the Vietnam War. It was just one incident.
Separate interesting question. How open has the existing government in Vietnam been in providing history about the war or access to their archives? We know that there's been some access, and you could talk about that.
Well, they've allowed very limited access to the Western researchers that have gone in. I've seen very little to come out that would be of strategic interest, but they have published quite a bit. They published something called Party Documents that has a lot of information about their strategic decision making. They've published a lot of unit histories, division histories, other battle histories. And the varying degrees of usefulness, but in terms of actual document, if you think of our foreign relations series that has meetings of the National Security Council and memos between the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense, I don't think anything of that sort really has come out, and I don't know that we'll see it for quite a long time.
By the way,
Related to that, just real quickly, there was a brief period where the Russians allowed Western scholars into the archives to get KGB materials. And you know who the scholar is, he's been at Hopkins.
Stephen Morris.
Yeah, Stephen Morris, who was originally, I think, an Australian, got access to a lot of that. And it's fascinating, but then they tightened it up.
And the Chinese let some things out. A lot of them can be viewed on the Cold War International History Project website. I don't know that anyone's actually written the story of that, but my sense is they publish those to make the Vietnamese look bad, because there's most of it is meetings between the Vietnamese and the Chinese, and so I think they've been trying to shape the history of that.
By the way, quickly, one of the questions was, how did that girl react when I talked to her about the Pledge of Allegiance? And the answer was, she said, "Thank you very much, but I'm sticking to my convictions." There's a biblical quote that goes, "There are none so blind as those who will not see." I did my best. However, other kids in the room heard my discussion. So it did some good. It got spread around a little bit. Next, we're running out of time here. Next question for Dr. Kort. Can you elaborate on the revisionist thinking that a blockade of North Vietnam would not have caused the Soviets or Chinese to enter the war? Yeah. What can we justify the idea that blockading North Vietnam would not have caused the Chinese or Russians to enter the war?
One thing I can cite is an interview. I.F. Stone had an article interviewing Mao, and Mao repeatedly said that he was not, China was not going to get involved in fighting like this unless the United States invaded China and attacked China. There's also the matter of, Mark has written about this as well, and so other people that for China, they didn't want to get into tangle with the United States. They wanted to keep things limited. Some of the Asian scholars, which I didn't mention their names, report that Mao, the Chinese told the Vietnamese, unless China is attacked, you guys are going to have to deal with this, without our troops. So there seems to be, again, there was always that possibility, and you always had to consider it. But as a number of people said, the risk seems to have been quite low.
We also did experiment with it in December of '72. We shut down Haiphong Harbor with mines, and the Chinese did nothing, and the Russians did nothing except not let their ships go there. So, pretty good answer.
We're out of time. One last question that anybody can comment on. What do we think about the fact that Cam Ranh Bay is now a U.S. Navy port of call?
I don't see any downside to it at all. It gives us access. We need access. If it promotes a better relationship with the Vietnamese, I'm all for that.
It is important to note that the official position is that they will never allow Cam Ranh Bay to be an official base of any outside nation. I think we're out of time. We have a few more questions left, but I think it's been a fairly good exchange, and thank you everyone for coming, and thanks to the speakers.
We appreciate everybody coming. We promised the History Center we'd turn loose this room at 2:30 because they have a wedding tonight. So thank you very much. Appreciate your attendance.